The first time Mike Ramble uncovered the conspiracy, he thought he stopped it. He was wrong. Closing time. A spy thriller. Chapter 1. Earl's marine supply guy in Fort Pierce had exactly one of the impeller kits the Conch Republic's bilge pump needed. Special order. Sitting behind the counter since March, because the guy who'd ordered it died before he could pick it up, which struck Mike as the kind of detail that belonged in an obituary nobody had bothered writing. He paid cash, tucked the box under one arm, and came out of Coastal Marine Supply into a morning that had already decided to be 90 degrees by 10 o'clock, the asphalt in the lot giving off that shimmer that made the whole block look like it was thinking about melting. He didn't need to be on Avenue D. The marine supply place sat 2 exits north on US 1. A clean, 15-minute shot back to Colusa Cay if he took the highway like a reasonable person. But Mike had developed, over 3 years of unemployed mornings, a private theory that the best coffee on the Treasure Coast existed exclusively in places that didn't advertise it. And somewhere in the back half of his memory sat a 6-block stretch called Palmetto Row that he hadn't driven through since maybe his second month in Florida, when he was still learning which roads went where. He took the detour because he wanted a cortado and didn't feel like making the bad kind at home. Palmetto Row ran 6 blocks of one-story storefronts that had been built sometime in the 50s and never seriously updated since. Faded awnings, hand-painted signs, a laundromat with a wall of dryers visible through plate glass like a row of portholes. A barbershop with 2 chairs and a window full of faded photographs of haircuts nobody had requested since disco died. A bakery that smelled like guava paste through a closed door from 40 feet away, which told Mike everything he needed to know about the quality of the ventilation and the quality of the bakery both. Lazo's Mercado sat dead center of the block, a corner storefront with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising Pan Cubano Fresco, and a faded Goya banner that had probably come free with some long-ago bulk order, and a window display of canned goods stacked into a pyramid that had clearly taken somebody real pride to build, and even more pride to maintain against the laws of gravity and the occasional bump from a passing customer. Mike parked the truck against the curb, left the impeller kit on the seat, and went in past a bell over the door that rang and a key slightly off from itself, like it had been replaced once with a bell from a different door entirely. The smell hit him immediately. Roasted coffee, fresh bread, the sharp green smell of plantains stacked in a crate by the register, and underneath all of it, the particular mustiness of a building old enough to have settled fully into its own bones. A radio behind the counter played a station heavy on horns and clave. Not loud, just present, the kind of background music a place plays not for customers but for itself. An old man worked the register, 70-some years old by the look of him, built compact and weathered, silver hair combed back neat, wearing a gayabera with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the heat outside, not having any business letting a man dress that formally. He had a face that had clearly smiled a great deal over the decades, the lines around his eyes deep with it, though right now the smile wasn't anywhere visible. "Café," Mike said, which exhausted roughly 40% of his usable Spanish. "Cortado colada, café con leche." The old man said it like a man reciting a short menu he'd recited 10,000 times, already turning toward the espresso machine behind him. An ancient La Sambali that looked like it had been steaming milk since before either one of them was born. "You want sugar in it, or you want to pretend you're healthy?" "Sugar." "Good man." He worked the machine with hands that knew exactly how much pressure the portafilter wanted, and not a gram more, the whole process taking maybe 90 seconds, ending with a small cup set on the counter with the kind of pride a man takes in something he's done well for 50 years and never once been thanked for properly. $1.50. Mike paid, drank it standing at the counter because there wasn't anywhere else in the small store to drink it, and it was, in fact, exactly the good kind, dark and sweet enough to make his back teeth ache pleasantly. "This is the place," Mike said. "Should have come back sooner." Everybody says that. The old man wiped down the machine's portafilter with a rag that lived permanently looped through his apron string. You from around here? Don't recognize the truck. Calusa K. North a ways. Long way to come for coffee. Was already in town. Got lucky. The old man nodded like that satisfied him completely, which it apparently did, and went back to restocking a shelf of canned tomato sauce that didn't strictly need restocking, the small, fidgeting maintenance of a man who liked his hands occupied even when the store was quiet. The bell over the door rang its off-key ring again, and two men came in without the particular energy of customers. No browsing, no glance at the canned goods pyramid, just a straight line to the register, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who'd walked this exact path enough times that it had stopped requiring their full attention. The first one was big in the way gym-built men get big, forearms like he spent serious hours on them, and not much time on anything below the waist, a golf shirt tucked into khakis with a phone clipped to his belt like a man who'd once carried a badge and missed the feeling of carrying one. The second was smaller, leaner, doing most of the actual talking, the kind of build that suggested speed mattered more to him than mass. Netu, the smaller one said, friendly, the particular friendliness that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. Beautiful morning. Hank's not with you today. Hank sent us. Hank's got a schedule, you know how it is. The smaller man set both hands flat on the counter, a posture that managed to look casual and possessive of the space at the same time. We're just here for the cleaning fee. In and out, 2 minutes, you don't even gotta stop selling your tomato sauce. I told Hank already. I told him 3 times already. Nobody's cleaning anything. Nobody's ever cleaned anything. Nito's voice had gone tight. The warmth from a minute ago folded away somewhere out of sight, replaced by the careful, controlled tone of a man who'd had this conversation enough times to know exactly how far he could push it before it stopped being a conversation. This is extortion. I know the word. I know it in 2 languages. It's a service fee, Netu. Sanitation, pest control, general upkeep of the block. The bigger one spoke for the first time, voice flat, bored almost. A man reciting the company line because reciting it was easier than thinking about what the line actually meant. You don't pay it, things get dirty real fast around here. Things get broken. Health inspector starts finding rats nobody's ever seen before. You understand? There are no rats. There will be. Mike stood at the counter with his cortado half finished, close enough to hear every word, far enough that neither man had bothered to register him as anything other than a customer minding his own coffee, which was exactly the read he wanted them to have for about 4 more seconds. 200, the smaller one said. Same as last week. Same as it's gonna be next week, week after that. Unless you want to talk about the bigger conversation, the one about maybe just selling the building and letting somebody who's not 70 whatever years old worry about rats and broken windows. Nito's jaw worked, and his hand went slow and obvious toward the register, the particular slowness of a man who decided arguing cost him more than $200 did, an economic calculation made over and over until it had worn a groove into him. That's a lot of canned tomato sauce you're gonna have to sell to make that back up, the bigger one said, not unkindly, the kind of remark a man makes when he's stopped seeing the cruelty in his own job a long time ago. Mike set his cup down on the counter. He's not paying that, Mike said. Both men turned. The smaller one first, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face before it smoothed back into something professional. The bigger one a half-beat slower, the kind of slow that came from a man who relied more on size than reflex. This your business, friend, the smaller one said. Wasn't, 2 minutes ago. Mike kept his hands visible, loose, his voice pitched conversational, the register he used to use in rooms where the temperature could go either way, depending entirely on tone. Cleaning fee for what, exactly? I don't see a cleaning crew. I don't see a truck outside with a logo on it. I see two grown men leaning on a man old enough to be either one of your grandfathers. You don't know what you're stepping into. Probably not. Tell me. The bigger one's hand drifted, casual, toward his hip. Not quite a reach, more a reminder of where a reach would go if it needed to. And Mike clocked it the way he clocked everything these days without consciously deciding to, filing it under escalation available, not yet committed. This is between us and Netu, the smaller one said. Family business, you understand. We go way back. Funny. He doesn't look like family that's glad to see you. Behind the register, Netu had gone very still, hand still hovering near the open drawer, his eyes moving between Mike and the two men with an expression Mike recognized from his own line of work a long time ago. The specific math a man runs when a stranger's just inserted himself into a situation that might get worse on his account, weighing whether the help's worth the risk of the help leaving. Don't, Netu said quiet, mostly to Mike. Please. Is fine. I pay they go, is fine. It's not fine, Netu. You just told me yourself it's not fine. 2 languages worth of not fine. The smaller one's friendly mask had thinned down to almost nothing now, the eyes doing all the talking, calculating something, whether this was worth a real problem on a Tuesday morning, whether the stranger in front of him was a one-time nuisance or something that needed reporting up a chain. Mike had stood on the other side of exactly that calculation, more times than he could count, used to make it himself about other people, and recognizing it now from the receiving end gave him an odd, brief vertigo, like looking at a photograph of a room from an angle he'd never stood in before. You got a name? The smaller one said. Don't need one for this conversation. Everybody's got a name. Sure. Mine's not the one that matters right now. Yours might be, if Netu here decides he wants to talk to the police about a cleaning fee nobody's ever seen a cleaning crew attached to. Mike kept his voice level, almost bored, the tone doing more work than volume ever could in a room this small. Or maybe he doesn't talk to police. Maybe he just stops paying, and you two come back next week, and we have this same conversation again. Except next week I might not feel like being polite about it. The bigger one's hand had stayed at his hip the whole time, not moving further, a held position rather than a threat actively building, and something in his face had started doing math of its own. Not fear exactly, more like a man recalculating the shape of a job that had seemed simple 20 seconds ago. This isn't smart, the smaller one said. Whoever you are, you don't know what you're poking at. Educate me. Nobody answered that. The radio behind the counter kept playing its low horn music, oblivious, and a customer Mike hadn't noticed come in. A woman in her 60s with a shopping basket half full of plantains and a box of crackers stood frozen by the canned goods pyramid, clearly deciding whether to set the basket down quietly and back out the door or stay and watch whatever this turned into. The smaller one looked at Netu, looked at Mike, did one more pass of the math, and apparently came out the other side of it, deciding the cost of pushing further today exceeded whatever the $200 was actually worth to whoever signed his checks. We'll be back, he said, to Netu, not to Mike. A deliberate choice, the smaller man refusing to give Mike the satisfaction of being addressed directly. Tell Hank you had company today. See what he says about that. They left without hurrying, the bell over the door ringing its off-key ring on the way out, and through the front window, Mike watched them cross the street to a black pickup truck parked at an angle that suggested they hadn't expected to need it parked for getaway purposes. The bigger one glancing back once at the storefront with an expression that wasn't quite anger yet, but was clearly building towards something in that direction. The store went quiet, except for the radio. The woman with the basket of plantains let out a breath she'd apparently been holding the whole time, and set her basket down on the counter like nothing at all had happened, which, Mike supposed, was its own kind of survival skill in a place like this. The practiced art of not seeing things that were dangerous to have seen. "You shouldn't have done that," Netu said finally, his hand coming away from the register drawer, sliding it shut soft instead of slamming it, the careful motion of a man who'd learned a long time ago that drawing attention to anger cost more than the anger itself was worth. "Probably not. They will come back. Worse next time. Always worse next time." Netu looked old suddenly, older than he'd looked 90 seconds ago, pouring coffee with a craftsman's pride, the lines around his eyes deepening into something closer to exhaustion than expression. "You don't live here. You drink your coffee, you go home to Calusa K, and they still come back here Thursday, and I still have to pay, except now maybe angrier, maybe more. What's the 200 actually for? For nothing. For breathing. For having a store somebody wants." Netu rang up the woman's plantains and crackers with hands that had gone slightly unsteady, the fine motor tremor of adrenaline working its way back out of an old man's system. 2 months now. First it was the inspector, citations for things that were fine for 30 years, suddenly not fine. Then it was Hank's people, the cleaning fee, the sanitation fee, whatever they want to call extorting an old man this week. Then a letter, very polite, very nice paper, wanting to buy my building. I don't sell. I tell them I don't sell, and the citations get worse, and now this. Letter from who? Heritage Square. Some company. Heritage Square Holdings. Netu said the name with the flat, careful precision of a man who'd practiced saying it without spitting, the particular distaste reserved for a phrase that had cost him sleep. Very generous, they say. Very generous offer for a building my father bought with cash money in 1979, working 2 jobs 4 years to save it. And now some company with a name that sounds like a golf course wants to give me money to walk away from it. Mike stood with that a moment, the cortado gone cold in front of him, a particular cold settling into his own chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning's half-hearted effort against the morning heat. He'd heard this song before. Different key, same melody. A shell company with a pleasant name, a wave of sudden citations, muscle dressed up as a service fee, a generous offer arriving right on schedule once the squeeze had done enough of its quiet work. He'd spent the better part of a month entangling exactly this architecture 40 miles north, and he'd told himself, walking out of that county commission meeting with Earl Tucker's applause still ringing in his ears, that the thing was finished. Closed. A clean win, documented, a congressman's name finally typed plain on a page. Apparently the architecture didn't close down just because one job site got shut. Heritage Square, Mike said. You got that letter. Why? Because I think I might have met its cousin. Netu studied him a long moment, the kind of assessment Mike had gotten used to receiving from strangers over 3 years. Except this one wasn't running a half-remembered cable news clip behind his eyes, just trying to work out plainly whether the stranger who just embarrassed 2 collectors in his store was a help worth trusting or a complication worth fearing. Marisol, Netu called toward a curtained doorway behind the register, the name carrying clear over the radio's horn section. Mija. Ven aquí un momento. A young woman came through the curtain a moment later, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, a textbook tucked under one arm with a highlighter capped between her teeth, the particular harried look of somebody who'd been studying in a back room and had clearly heard at least the tail end of whatever just happened out front. Abuelo, was that? She stopped, looked at Mike, recalibrated whatever sentence she'd started. Is everything okay? I heard yelling. Everything is fine, Netu said, in the tone of a man who'd said everything is fine roughly 400 times in the last 2 months, and had stopped expecting anybody to believe him, including himself. This man helped. Get the letter. The Heritage Square letter, the one in the drawer with the citations. Marisol looked at Mike a beat longer, something sharp and assessing in it, a different flavor of suspicion than her grandfather's. Less, can I trust this stranger? And more, what does this stranger actually want? And what's it going to cost us to find out? Who are you? She said. Mike Ramble. Something flickered behind her eyes, the 4-second delay Mike had learned to expect on tourists and barflies and rookie cops alike. Except hers resolved differently, not recognition exactly, more like a half-formed memory snagging on something. Wait, she said. I read about you. The marina thing. Up in Martin County, the development that got shut down a few weeks back. She said it slowly, working out the shape of a coincidence that didn't feel, even as she said it, entirely like a coincidence. That was you. That was me. And now you're standing in my grandfather's store. Wasn't planning on it this morning. Wanted a cortado. Mike glanced at the curtained doorway, at the textbook still tucked under her arm, at the old man behind the register straightening his apron string like the gesture might straighten out the rest of the morning along with it. But I think your grandfather and a man named Earl Tucker just found out they've got the same problem wearing 2 different names. Marisol disappeared back through the curtain without another word, and came out a minute later with a manila folder, thin, the kind that had clearly been opened and closed and reread enough times that the corners had gone soft. She set it on the counter and opened it herself rather than handing it over, a small but deliberate choice, keeping a measure of control over what got seen and in what order. On top sat a letter on heavy cream stock, embossed letterhead, the kind of paper that cost real money to print specifically so it would feel substantial in your hand even while it said nothing substantial at all. Heritage Square Holdings, LLC across the top, in a serif font designed to read as established, trustworthy, the same family of invisible confidence Mike had seen on Sandpiper's letterhead a month ago. Underneath it, a stack of code enforcement citations, 11 of them dated across the last 8 weeks, each one citing a different violation: improper signage, inadequate fire suppression spacing, an expired health permit that Marisol had a renewal receipt for stapled right behind it, proof the permit had in fact been current the entire time. And beneath that, near the bottom of the stack, a single sheet that didn't belong with the rest, a property appraisal, firm name printed at the top, valuing the building at a figure that made Mike's jaw tighten slightly even before he'd finished reading the line underneath it. Whitcomb & Sons, licensed appraisers. You know this name? Marisol said, watching his face do whatever it had just done. I know this name, Mike said. Better than I'd like to. Outside, through the front window, the black pickup that had carried the 2 collectors away pulled back into view, slower this time, idling past the storefront at a speed that wasn't quite stopping and wasn't quite leaving either. The bigger one's face turned toward the glass, marking the truck parked at the curb, marking, Mike understood with a small cold certainty, exactly which vehicle belonged to the stranger who just cost them a Tuesday morning's collection. Chapter 2. The truck followed him for 6 blocks before peeling off at the light by the Winn-Dixie, and Mike clocked every one of those blocks in his mirror without once changing his speed, the same disciplined nothing he'd given the gray sedan back in Colusa K. Whoever drove it wanted to be seen. That was the whole point of the slow roll past the storefront window. Not a tale so much as a calling card, the visual equivalent of a man cracking his knuckles before he says something he wants you to remember. He drove home with the windows up for once, air conditioning straining against a heat that had climbed past 90, while he stood in Lazo's Mercado watching an old man's hand tremble over a cash register, and somewhere around the Stewart Bridge he caught himself gripping the wheel tighter than the traffic in front of him called for. He told himself out loud, alone in the cab, that this wasn't his fight. He didn't believe himself even a little, and he knew it before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. He went back the next morning anyway, telling himself it was for the coffee, which was true in the same way that a man tells himself he's just stopping by a poker game to watch. Palmetto Row looked different in the full light of a Wednesday, A delivery truck blocking half the street outside the bakery. A kid on a bicycle weaving through pedestrians with a bag of laundry balanced on the handlebars. An old man Mike hadn't seen yesterday sweeping the sidewalk outside the barber shop with the slow, ceremonial thoroughness of a man for whom sweeping the sidewalk was less a chore than a ritual. The block smelled like bread and diesel, and underneath both, the green tang of the Indian River 2 streets over, carried in on whatever breeze managed to find its way this far from the water. The bell over Lazo's door rang its off-key ring, and this time Marisol stood behind the register instead of her grandfather, textbook closed and pushed to one side of the counter, a yellow legal pad in front of her covered in handwriting, dense enough that Mike could tell from 6 feet away she'd been at it a while. "He's in back," she said, before Mike got a word out. "Sleeping. Didn't sleep right last night, which means I didn't either, which means I've had 4 cups of this stuff since 6 a.m., and I might actually be a hazard to operate machinery at this point." "You always work the counter?" "Most afternoons. Mornings I've got class, online mostly, finishing up a business degree at Indian River State, which is its own kind of joke given everything currently happening to an actual business I care about." She said it without much humor in it, the dry, flat delivery of somebody too tired to bother dressing up the sarcasm. "You want the cortado, or you want to actually talk?" "Can have both." She worked the machine with less ceremony than her grandfather had, quicker, more efficient, the motions of someone who'd learned the process out of necessity rather than love, and set the cup down without the same pride Netu had shown, though it tasted, Mike noted, exactly as good. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "Wanted the coffee?" "Try again." Mike drank a third of the cup before answering that, partly to buy himself a second, partly because the coffee really was that good. "Wanted to know what I walked into yesterday. Whether it was a one-time thing, or whether your grandfather's been living through that every week for 2 months. "Every week." "Sometimes twice." Marisol turned the legal pad around so he could see it. Rows of dates in the left margin, a brief note beside each one. Citation, signage, citation, Fire Lane, Hanks Guys, $200, Hanks Guys, $200. The entries running back 9 weeks in a hand that had started out neat and gotten progressively more cramped and angry as it went. "I started keeping this about a month ago. Figured, if nobody else was going to write it down, I would." Smart. Smart would have been doing it the first week instead of the 4th. "I kept thinking it'd stop on its own. Things like this, you keep thinking there's a logical end to it. Somebody's gonna realize they made a mistake, somebody's gonna call off the dogs." She tapped the pad with one finger, hard, like she was tapping some sense into the page itself. "It's not stopping. It's getting worse on a schedule, like whoever's running it has a calendar with a deadline circled on it, and they're working backward from that date." "What's the citation history actually look like?" She pulled a second folder from under the counter, thicker than the one from yesterday, organized with the kind of obsessive neatness that told Mike she'd spent real hours on this, tabs color-coded, a printed cover sheet she'd clearly made herself in some free software. 11 citations since the first week of May, all from the same inspector. Guy named Frank Mercer. Before May, "You want to know how many citations this store got in the last 6 years? Tell me." 0. Not one. My grandfather's had this building since '79, and in 6 years of me working this counter, we never once got a citation, because we run a clean store and we fix what needs fixing before anybody has to tell us to. She flipped to the first tab. May 7th, improper signage spacing. The same sign that's been hanging in that window for 11 years, no complaints, nothing changed about it, except suddenly it's 2 inches too close to the door frame, which is apparently a code violation nobody enforced for a decade, until exactly this spring. What happened with that one? Paid the fine. $150. Didn't want to fight it, figured it was a fluke. She flipped the next tab. 11th, inadequate fire suppression spacing around the register. There's a fire extinguisher 18 inches from where code apparently wants it, which, fine, we moved it, paid another fine, figured okay, 2 flukes. And then, it kept happening. Health permit expired. Except it hadn't. I've got the renewal receipt, the actual state confirmation number. And it still took us 3 weeks and 2 follow-up visits from Mercer to get that one dismissed, during which we operated under threat of closure for selling food without a valid permit we definitely had. She closed the folder, harder than necessary, the sound flat and final. By citation 6 or 7, I stopped thinking fluke and started thinking pattern. And by citation 9, I started thinking somebody's doing this on purpose, and now we're at 11, and I've stopped thinking and started just writing it all down, because apparently that's the only weapon I've got. Mike turned the legal pad back toward her, finished the cortado, set the empty cup down careful on the counter the way you'd set down something you didn't want to startle. Tell me about the cleaning fee. Started about 6 weeks ago. 2 guys, sometimes the same 2 from yesterday, sometimes different ones. There's a rotation, I think, like a shift schedule. $200 a week. Cash, no receipt, no explanation that holds up to 30 seconds of actual thought. They call it a service fee. Sanitation. General upkeep of the block. She said the words with visible disgust, like they tasted worse coming out of her mouth than they had going into Hank's Collectors. There's no cleaning crew, Mr. Ramble. Nobody's ever cleaned anything. The dumpster behind this building's been emptied by the same city contract for 15 years, same as it's always been. The fee's not for a service. It's a tax for staying open. And the buyout letter. For that one, she didn't reach for a folder. She reached instead under the counter into a drawer Mike hadn't noticed, and came out with the same cream stock letter from yesterday. Except this time he saw she'd annotated it in pencil, small precise marks in the margins, underlines beneath specific phrases. We recognize the deep roots your family has built in this community, the letter read, in language Mike had now read enough variations of to recite from memory. And we believe this offer reflects both fair market value and our genuine respect for that legacy. Underneath fair market value, Marisol had written in pencil, small and furious, appraised by who? Whitcomb, Mike said. Whitcomb and Sons. Same name on the appraisal attached to the offer. She tapped the figure printed below the letter's flowery paragraph. A number that looked generous on its face, the same way Earl Tucker's had looked generous on its face, the same particular flavor of generous that meant somebody had calculated exactly how much it would take to make refusal feel unreasonable rather than principled. I looked them up. Whitcomb's not even based in Fort Pierce. They're out of Stewart. I know where they're based. Something in his tone made her look up sharper than she had all conversation. You actually know something about this. This isn't just you being a good Samaritan who happened to walk in at the right moment. I know the company that hired them. Different name, different shell. Sandpiper Holdings up north of here ran the exact same play on a marina I happen to do odd jobs for. Same appraisal firm, running the numbers hot to make a forced sale look generous. Same citation pattern, different inspector. Same muscle dressed up as something legal, different crew. Mike turned the buyout letter a half-turn on the counter. The same unconscious habit he'd watched 2 different women perform with 2 different cups in 2 different diners. And it struck him, briefly, as a strange tick to have picked up from people he hadn't known very long. Different town. Same hand running it. Marisol sat with that a long moment, her expression cycling through something that looked in quick succession like vindication, then fear, then something closer to fury that had finally found a shape worth pointing at. So this isn't even about my grandfather's store, she said. It's not really about him at all. Your grandfather's store matters plenty. But no, it's not just about him. Mike thought about a wire transfer detail, folded soft at its creases, A name with no face attached. A PAC chairman finally typed plain across a filing sheet under a streetlight in a courthouse parking lot. There's a network behind this. Bigger than one Mercado. Bigger than one Marina. I shut down one piece of it a month ago. Looks like it just grew a different arm somewhere else. You shut it down. Slowed it down. Cost it a deal. Cost a few people their freedom or their jobs. Didn't shut down whoever's actually running the money. He didn't say the rest of it out loud yet. Reynolds, the PAC, the congressman's name he'd circled twice in his truck's glove box, partly because she hadn't earned the whole story yet, and partly because saying it made it heavier in a way he wasn't ready to carry in a conversation he'd only walked into yesterday. The curtain behind the register rustled, and Netu came through it slow, hair uncombed for once, wearing an undershirt instead of the gayabera, looking smaller than he had behind the register yesterday, the particular smallness of a man who'd slept badly and woken up into the same problem he'd fallen asleep worrying about. "You're back," he said to Mike, not quite a question, not quite an accusation either. "Wanted to understand what I walked into." "Now you understand." "Getting there." Netu looked at the legal pad, at the annotated letter, at his own granddaughter's face doing the particular work of trying to look composed for his benefit, and something in his shoulders sagged a degree further. "I told her not to make all this," he said, gesturing loosely at the folders, the color-coded tabs, the whole careful architecture Marisol had built out of 2 months of harassment. "I told her, just pay the fine, just pay the fee, is cheaper than fighting, is cheaper than the lawyer we can't afford anyway." "Abuelo, that's not." "Is true, mija. We don't have money for a lawyer. We barely have money for the fee, some weeks." Netu sat down heavily on a stool behind the counter that Mike hadn't noticed before, the kind of stool a man keeps nearby, for exactly the moments his knees stop cooperating with the rest of his plans. "I came to this country 45 years ago with nothing. Worked 2 jobs 4 years, saved every dollar, bought this building when nobody on this block believed a Cuban man should own anything bigger than a suitcase. I am not interested in losing it to some company with a name like a golf course, because I couldn't afford to fight back." "You don't have to afford it," Mike said. "Not the way you think." Both of them looked at him. "Last time," Mike said, "the man I was helping didn't pay me a lawyer's fee either. We built the case with documentation, a sympathetic detective, and a property records clerk who liked answering questions more than she liked filling out forms. Cost him nothing but time and a willingness to stand up at a public meeting and say a true thing out loud." "And it worked," Marisol said. Not quite a question, more like she wanted to hear him confirm it again, the way you ask someone to repeat good news a second time to make sure you heard it right. "It worked enough. Marina's still standing. Deal's dead. 3 men are looking at charges." Mike didn't add the rest, that the man actually behind it all was still standing too, untouched. A name on a PAC filing instead of a face in a courtroom. No version of this conversation needed that weight added to it yet. "I'm not promising you the same ending. Every situation's its own animal. But I know the shape of this one now, and knowing the shape's worth more than you'd think." Netu studied him a long while, the particular unhurried scrutiny of a man who'd survived more than one government's worth of broken promises in his life and had learned the hard way exactly how much weight to put on a stranger's confidence. "Why?" he said finally. "Why do you care about my store? You don't know me. You drink 1 coffee, you see 2 men yelling at an old man, and now you're back the next day asking questions like this is your fight." Mike thought about that question, longer than it probably deserved an answer, because it was, in fact, the only honest question anybody had asked him since he walked through that off-key door 2 days ago. "I spent 20 years working for people who told me the stakes were the whole world," he said. "Spent the last 3 thinking I was done with all of it, Done caring whether anybody won or lost anything bigger than a beach metal detector hobby. Then I watched a marina almost get stolen out from under a man who never did anything wrong except own something somebody else wanted, and I found out I still care more than I figured I would. Now I'm standing in your store watching the same thing happen to you, and I don't know how to explain it any better than that. Some fights find you, whether you go looking for them or not. Marisol watched him say it with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the middle of the answer from cautious assessment into something closer to a decision being made. "Okay," she said. "Then help me build the case the way you built the other one. I've got the citations, I've got the buyout letter, I've got 2 months of notes. I don't know how to turn that into something that actually stops them." "First thing," Mike said, "we find out who actually owns Heritage Square Holdings. Same way I found out who owns Sandpiper. Library computer, county records, registered agent address. Won't take long if it's built the same way the last one was built. And if it's not the same people, then we've learned something new and we start over." Mike pushed the empty Cortado cup toward her, a small gesture that felt in the moment like the closest thing to a handshake the conversation had offered. "But I'd put money on it being the same people, or close enough cousins that it doesn't much matter which one signs the actual checks." Outside, through the front window, a Fort Pierce code enforcement vehicle pulled to the curb directly in front of the Mercado, white with a county seal stenciled on the door, and a man got out of it with a clipboard under one arm, moving toward the entrance with the unhurried, methodical gait of somebody who did this exact walk several times a day and had stopped finding any of it remarkable. Nito's whole body went rigid on the stool. "Mercer," he said, quiet, more breath than voice. The bell over the door rang its off-key ring a third time that morning, and Frank Mercer stepped into the Mercado in a county polo shirt gone damp at the collar from the heat, clipboard raised slightly like a shield, eyes already moving across the shelves and the doorframe, and the fire extinguisher's exact distance from the wall before he'd said a single word to anyone standing inside. Chapter 3. Mercer's eyes found the fire extinguisher before they found anyone's face, a habit so practiced it looked almost involuntary, the particular tunnel vision of a man who'd been trained to see violations first and people second. 18 inches, he said, to no one in particular, more like a man confirming a fact to himself. "That's better." "You measured it yourself last visit," Marisol said, voice tight, the legal pad fury from 5 minutes ago, compressing down into something colder and more controlled now that an actual target stood in front of her. "We moved it that same afternoon. You came back twice since then. There's nothing left to cite. Just doing a routine follow-up, ma'am." Mercer clicked his pen, uncapped, capped, a small fidgeting tell that Mike filed away without quite meaning to. He was younger than Mike had pictured from the citation history alone, maybe 35, soft through the middle, in the particular way of a man who sat in a county vehicle most of his day, a wedding ring on one hand and a county lanyard with 3 different badges clipped to it, the visual armor of bureaucratic legitimacy. "Got a complaint called in about standing water near the rear entrance. Mosquito concern." "Nobody called in a complaint," Marisol said. "There's no standing water. It's been 90 degrees and dry for 2 weeks. Complaint doesn't have to be accurate to require a follow-up, ma'am. I just gotta clear it." Mercer moved toward the back of the store without waiting for permission, the unhurried gait of a man whose authority had never once been seriously questioned, and didn't expect today to be the first time. Mike didn't follow him. Stood at the counter instead, watching Nito's hands, which had gone still on his knees, watching the particular stillness of a man holding his breath through something he'd survived 11 times already, and had no faith he'd survive a 12th time any differently. Mercer came back from the rear of the store 2 minutes later, clipboard still raised, face arranged into the practiced neutrality of a man who'd found nothing and was somehow disappointed about it. Looks clear today, he said. I'll note it cleared. You folks have a good one. He left the way he'd come, unhurried, the bell ringing its off-key note behind him. And through the window, Mike watched him climb back into the county vehicle and sit there a moment before pulling away, phone already up to his ear before the truck had finished backing out of the spot. That's it, Marisol said, once the truck had cleared the block. That's the whole visit. 5 minutes, no violation, and he still drove out here on a complaint that doesn't exist. She looked at Mike with an expression caught somewhere between vindication and exhaustion. You see what I mean now? It's not enforcement. It's a leash. He just comes by to remind us he can. I see it, Mike said. He stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to copy the dates and citation numbers off Marisol's legal pad into his own phone, long enough to drink a second cortado he didn't strictly need, and left with a promise to come back once he'd run down what he could on Heritage Square's paper trail. Netu walked him to the door himself, slower than yesterday, and gripped Mike's forearm at the threshold with a hand that still had real strength in it despite everything else about the morning suggesting otherwise. Thank you, Netu said. Whatever happens, thank you for seeing it. Most people walk past and don't see anything at all. Wasn't hard to see once I was standing in it. Is hard to see when you're the one it's happening to. Everything looks normal from inside, a slow boil. Netu let go of his arm, stepped back, the door's bell ringing once more as Mike pushed through it into the heat. Drive safe, Mr. Ramble. Colusa KPD's lobby hadn't changed since Mike's last visit. Same bolted plastic chairs, same yellowed out-of-order sign on the water fountain, same faded most wanted flyers fading further into ghosts of themselves. But the rookie behind the desk had apparently graduated past the awestruck phase, because this time he just nodded Mike toward the back without bothering to mention the hearings at all, which felt in its own small way like progress for somebody. Carol Jennings's office looked like a woman had been living in it rather than working from it. Stacks of folders that hadn't been there a month ago. A second coffee mug joining World's Okayest Detective on the desk. This one plain white and chipped, both of them empty. The photo of Cody Jr. and his snook had been pushed to the very edge of the monitor, like it had been jostled out of its spot by something more urgent, and nobody had bothered restoring the arrangement. You look worse than last time, Mike said, sitting without being asked. The chair across from her desk having become, somewhere in the last month, a place he apparently had standing permission to occupy. Last time, I'd had a good week. Don't have those anymore, apparently. Jennings didn't look up right away, finishing whatever she was typing with 2 fingers and a scowl, the universal posture of a woman who'd learned to type functionally but never gracefully. What do you want, Ramble? I'm guessing it's not a social call, on account of you've never once made one of those. Fort Pierce. Palmetto Row. Cuban grocery called Lazo's Mercado. Not my jurisdiction. I know, it's not your jurisdiction. I'm not asking you to make an arrest. I'm asking you to look at a citation pattern and tell me if it smells like the same thing we already proved up north. That got her to look up. Tell me, she said. He laid it out, the cleaning fee, the 11 citations in 8 weeks against 0 in 6 years, the Whitcomb appraisal, the Heritage Square letter on Creamstock that read almost word for word, like a cousin of Sandpiper's pitch. Jennings listened without interrupting, the particular stillness of a cop absorbing a pattern she'd already half expected to hear eventually, just not this soon, and not from this direction. Heritage Square, she said once he'd finished. Not Sandpiper. Different shell. Different shell, same family. I'd bet money the registered agent traces back to Wilmington same as the others, but I haven't run it yet. Wanted to talk to you first. Why me? St. Lucie County's got its own sheriff's office, its own detectives. Fort Pierce has municipal police of its own. Because none of them know what we know about Sandpiper, And you do. And because, Mike said, watching her face carefully now, I'm guessing your own case hasn't been moving the way you'd like, and I figured maybe you'd want to hear that the same hand might be reaching into a second pot. Jennings sat back, and something crossed her face that Mike hadn't seen on her before. Not the controlled frustration of a busy cop with too many open files, something closer to genuine anger held very carefully in check, the kind that comes from hitting a wall you didn't expect to be load-bearing. You want to know how my case is moving, she said. I'll tell you exactly how it's moving. 3 weeks ago, I had Castillo singing like a canary, Whitcomb's lawyer falling over himself to cooperate, Hammond's statement sitting clean on the state attorney's desk, and a pack filing with a sitting congressman's name on it as chairman. 3 weeks ago, this was the best case I'd built in 11 years on this job. And now the file's got a federal flag on it. She said it flat, the kind of flat that costs a person effort to maintain. No explanation. No phone call from anybody willing to put their name on the reason. Just a notation that appeared in the system Tuesday, saying the matter's under coordination with a federal agency pending further review, which in plain English means it's been taken away from me and parked somewhere I can't see it, by somebody who didn't feel like telling me why. Which agency? Doesn't say. I asked. Got told that information wasn't available to me at this time, by a state attorney's office liaison who sounded like she was reading off a script somebody handed her 20 minutes before she called me. Jennings pushed one of the folder stacks a few inches across the desk. An aimless gesture, more frustration finding an outlet than any actual filing being accomplished. Castillo's still sitting in county on the local charges, the ones that don't touch the pack or the wire money. Hammond's lawyer says his client's still cooperating, but cooperating with who now? That's the question nobody's answering me straight. And Whitcomb's case just quietly got continued twice, no explanation either time. Judge signed off both continuances without a hearing. Somebody's burying it. Somebody's burying it slow, careful, through channels that all look procedurally legitimate on paper, which is the worst kind of burying, because there's no single decision I can point to and call corrupt. Just a series of perfectly normal-looking delays that all happen to be pointing the same direction. She rubbed at her eyes with the heel of one hand, the gesture of a woman who hadn't slept properly and longer than one bad night could account for. You ever work a case like that? Where every individual piece looks clean and the whole picture's rotten? More than once. How'd you used to handle it? Badly, mostly. 20 years and I never found a clean way through that kind of fog. Best I ever managed was finding one piece small enough that nobody had bothered to protect it yet, and pulling on that instead of the big rotten middle everybody already knew to guard. Jennings considered that, and something in her posture shifted, the frustration compressing back down into the colder, more useful shape of a working plan. Fort Pierce, she said. That's outside the federal flag. Nobody's bothered to protect Frank Mercer yet, because nobody federals looked twice at a county code inspector in a town 40 minutes from where the actual flag landed. That's my read too. You said 11 citations in 8 weeks. She pulled a legal pad of her own toward her, different handwriting than Marisol's, blockier, more decisive. Run me through them again. Every date, every code section cited. Mike read off what he'd copied from Marisol's pad, and Jennings wrote as he talked, occasionally stopping him to repeat a date or a citation number, cross-referencing something in her head that Mike couldn't see yet but could tell from the speed of her pen was assembling into a shape she found increasingly familiar. Same code sections, she said when he'd finished. Signage spacing, fire suppression clearance, health permit lapses. I'd bet you a week's pay those exact same code sections show up if you pull Mercer's full citation history for the last year, not just against your grocery store, but against every property Heritage Square's been sniffing around. How do I get his full history? You don't. You're not a cop. And St. Lucie County's not going to hand a private citizen a code inspector's full work record on a hunch. She tapped the pen against the pad, thinking. The particular thinking of a woman working out exactly how far past her own jurisdiction she was willing to lean. But I've got a buddy in St. Lucie Sheriff's, worked a joint task force with him 3 years back, fella named Dave Tran. He owes me a favor. And Frank Mercer's public record requests are exactly the kind of boring administrative pull that doesn't trip any wires anywhere, because nobody's flagged code enforcement as interesting yet. You'd do that? I'm not going to sit here and watch the same playbook run twice in one summer while a federal flag sits on my own case like a lid on a pot. If I can't cook the meal I started, I can at least help you start a different one. She circled something on the legal pad, hard enough to nearly tear through. I'll call Tran today. Should have something by tomorrow, day after at the latest. Citation history, complaint logs. If these complaints Mercer's been responding to are as fake as the standing water one you just described, there'll be a pattern in who's filing them. Bet you another week's pay, it's the same handful of names or no name at all. Anonymous tips logged by a supervisor who's never once required a callback number. Who's supervisor? County Code Enforcement Director. Name's Patricia Voss, far as I remember, though I haven't looked at that org chart in years. Jennings caught herself the moment the name left her mouth. The same small flicker of recognition Mike felt himself, both of them apparently thinking the same uncomfortable thought about a name that close to one they'd already buried in a different file. Coincidence, Mike said. Common surname. Wouldn't read too much into it yet. But she wrote it down anyway, underlined it once, the gesture of someone who didn't fully believe her own reassurance. I'll check if she's related to anybody interesting once Tran gets back to me. Probably nothing. Probably. They sat with that a moment, the office's window unit working through its own private struggle against the afternoon heat, and Jennings finally pushed the legal pad aside and looked at Mike directly. The particular look of someone about to say something she'd been holding back since he sat down. You know what bothers me most about all this, she said. Tell me. It's not that somebody's squeezing an old man out of a grocery store. Florida's lousy with people doing exactly that, every single day. And most of it never sees a badge or a courtroom, because most of it's technically maddeningly legal. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice dropping into something more private than procedural. What bothers me is the scale of it. Sandpiper, 4 shells, $6 million routed through a pack tied to a sitting congressman, all of it aimed at one marina. Now Heritage Square, running the exact same playbook 40 minutes south, against a 6-block strip nobody in Washington's ever heard of. That's not one rich man being greedy about one piece of waterfront he wants. That's infrastructure. That's somebody who's built a machine for doing this, over and over in town after town, and Colusa Cay and Fort Pierce just happen to be the 2 places I've personally watched it happen. How many more places, you figure? I don't know. That's what scares me. She sat back, the chair creaking under her, and for a second the tiredness on her face read less like overwork and more like genuine worry, a flavor of her Mike hadn't seen yet. You ever think about that, Ramble? About how many Earl Tuckers and Netu Lazos there might already be out there, 3 weeks from a forced sale, in towns small enough that nobody federal's ever gonna flag the file? I think about it more than I'd like to. Yeah. She picked the chipped white mug up, looked into its empty bottom like it might have refilled itself out of sheer will, set it back down disappointed. Well, let's go pull one more thread off this thing and see how far it runs before somebody federal decides to flag this one too. Mike walked out into a parking lot gone hazy with afternoon heat, the asphalt giving off that shimmer that made the strip mall's defunct travel agency sign look like it was floating a few inches above its own foundation. and sat in the truck a minute with the engine off before he turned the key, running back through everything Jennings had said. A federal flag with no name attached. A code enforcement director, who might or might not share a surname with a ghost on a wire transfer. A machine, Jennings had called it, built for doing this over and over, town after town. And Mike found himself doing the arithmetic he'd been avoiding since the courthouse parking lot a month ago. Not how many towns exactly, but how deep a man would have to dig, and how many old men's hands would have to tremble over how many cash registers before the machine ever ran out of fuel on its own. His phone buzzed against the bench seat before he'd gotten the truck started. A text from a number he didn't have saved, no name attached to the contact, 3 words and nothing else. Don't go back. He looked at it a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard, and the truck's engine still hadn't turned over by the time a second text landed underneath the first, same unsaved number, 4 more words that did considerably more work than the first 3 had. You're being watched, Mike. Chapter 4. Mike called the unknown number back before he'd finished pulling out of the police department lot, and got 4 rings, and then a recorded voice telling him the mailbox hadn't been set up yet, which told him exactly nothing, except that whoever sent those texts had either burned the SIM already or never planned on a conversation in the first place. He texted back anyway. Who is this? No reply came that afternoon, or that evening, or the next morning either, and Mike spent most of a sleepless night running through the short list of people who might know enough about his life to type "you're being watched" and mean it as a warning instead of a threat. The list wasn't long. It had exactly 1 name on it that fit, and that name hadn't called him in 3 weeks, not since a black sedan pulled out of a courthouse parking lot with half a job's payment still owed and a question still unanswered. He decided, somewhere around 4 in the morning, that worrying about a text from a ghost number wasn't a plan. Going back to Palmetto Row was at least something he could put his hands on. He went back Thursday, then Friday, then the following Tuesday, not because anybody asked him to, but because a man with no W-2 and a metal detector that had already turned up everything the beach was going to give him that month had, it turned out, more spare hours than sense. He told himself he was gathering intelligence. Mostly, he sat on a bench outside Lazo's drinking coffee and let the block tell him what it wanted to tell him, which was more than he expected and worse than he hoped. The barbershop 2 doors down belonged to a man named Robert Davis, who went by Bobby to everyone, including, as far as Mike could tell, his own wife, 61 years old, built lean and quick with hands that moved a straight razor like the razor owed him money. He ran 2 chairs, his own and one he rented out 3 days a week to a younger barber who mostly handled the kids, and a window full of photographs going back decades, fades and flat tops, and 1 truly heroic mullet from sometime in the early 90s that Bobby kept up there, he said, as a warning to future generations. You're the Marina fella, Bobby said, the second time Mike sat in his shop waiting on nothing in particular, just listening. Netu told me. Said you ran 2 of Hank's boys out of his store, with nothing but talking. Wasn't much more than that. Talking's plenty, you do it right. Bobby worked a fade on a kid, maybe 14. The kid's mother sitting in the waiting chair scrolling her phone with the specific patience of someone who'd done this every 2 weeks for 14 years. They been at me too, you know. Different flavor. Cleaning fee's the same, but mine's a fire code thing. Said my second chair's too close to the electrical outlet, made me move the whole station 8 inches to the left, which, fine, 8 inches didn't cost me nothing but a Saturday morning. Then they came back saying, the new spot's got a drainage issue underneath the floor, wanted me to get a plumber out to inspect a slab that's been here since Eisenhower. You get the plumber? Got a cousin who does plumbing. Had him look at it for free on account of family rates. Found nothing wrong, same as always. But that's 3 Saturdays now I lost moving chairs and waiting on cousins, and every Saturday's a Saturday I'm not cutting hair, which is the only way I make money in this life. Bobby snapped the cape off the kid with a flourish, brushed the back of his neck with a soft bristle brush. The whole motion practiced down to the half-second. $200 a week on top of that. I pay it because the alternative's apparently rats nobody's ever seen, and a window that gets broken in the night, which I know for a fact happened to Nito's cousin's restaurant up in Vero, so I don't need it spelled out twice. You ever think about not paying? Every single week. Then I think about my granddaughter's tuition, and I keep cutting hair instead of thinking about it too hard. Bobby looked at Mike in the mirror rather than turning around, the particular angle a barber uses to have a real conversation while still working. You gonna do something about this, or you just gathering stories for a book? Working on it. Work faster. $200 a week adds up different when you're 61, and your knees already cost you more than the chair rental brings in some months. The laundromat belonged to a woman named Diane Walker, who ran it with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of somebody who'd buried a husband and a business partner inside of 3 years and had decided, somewhere in there, that self-pity cost more than it was worth. She kept a small television mounted above the folding tables playing a Spanish telenovela with English captions on, for the regulars who don't speak either language all the way, and a fan blowing directly on the one chair customers actually wanted to sit in, which she guarded like a throne and rationed out to whoever looked hottest. Citation last week, she said, folding a stack of towels with the kind of speed that suggested 40 years of practice, not looking up from the work while she talked. Said my dryer exhaust vents too close to the building's setback line. Same vents been there since I bought this place, 1991. Same building, same vents, same setback. Suddenly, it's a problem. Same inspector? Mercer. Mercer, yeah. Polite enough fella. Doesn't even look happy doing it, which somehow makes it worse, like watching somebody apologize while they're stealing your wallet. She snapped a towel flat with a crack that startled a kid sleeping in a laundry cart 2 rows over. I paid the fine because fighting it costs more than the fine, and that's the whole trick of it, see? They don't need you to actually owe the money. They just need it to be cheaper for you to pay than to argue, every single time, until you're so tired of paying you start thinking about Heritage Square's nice offer instead. You get a letter from them too. Got it the same week as the citation. Funny how that works. She set the folded towels in a bin, started on the next stack without missing a beat. I'm 68 years old, Mr. Ramble. I don't need this fight. Some mornings, I think maybe I take their number and go live near my daughter in Orlando, and let somebody else worry about dryer exhaust setbacks for the rest of their natural life. What stops you? Pride mostly. And the fact that my husband's name's still on the lease, even though he's been gone 6 years, and some part of me figures selling out cheap to a company that's been lying to my face for 2 months feels like selling him out too, even though that's probably not logical, and I know it. She looked up at him then, finally, sharp and direct. You actually fixing this, or you just collecting sad stories like everybody else who's walked through here asking questions and then disappeared? Trying to fix it. Try harder, Diane said, exactly the way Bobby had. The whole block apparently working from the same unspoken script, and went back to her towels. The bakery belonged to a woman named Marie Joseph, Haitian, somewhere in her 50s, who ran a small operation specializing in pate côte and conch fritters and a bread so good Mike found himself buying a loaf he didn't need 3 separate mornings running, just to have an excuse to sit at her one small table and listen. She talked faster than anybody else on the block, the words tumbling out in an accent that turned plain sentences musical. And she'd clearly decided sometime in the last 2 months that the situation had become absurd enough to be funny even while it scared her. They cited me, she said, for my oven. My oven. Same oven 19 years, same gas line, same everything. And suddenly the man with the clipboard say my ventilation hood don't meet current code. Current code. Like the code changed last Tuesday specifically to bother my hood. She laughed, the kind of laugh that had a hard edge underneath it, and set a plate of fritters in front of Mike that he hadn't ordered and wasn't going to refuse. I tell my son about it on the phone. He say, "Mama, that sound illegal, you should call somebody." I say, "Son, who exactly I'm gonna call?" "The police." "The same county sent the man with the clipboard?" "You ever think about fighting the citations directly? Hearing, appeal, that kind of thing. You know how much a lawyer costs for that? You know what I make selling fritters?" She waved a hand, the gesture taking in the whole small shop, the oven, the modest counter, the 4 tables that constituted her entire physical kingdom. "I make enough to live. I make enough to send my son a little money sometimes. I do not make enough to fight a county and a company with a name like a hotel chain, both at the same time, with a lawyer who charges by the hour I do not have." "That's the whole design," Mike said, mostly to himself. "What design?" "Make it cheaper to give up than to fight back. Works on a marina owner, same as it works on a bakery, same as it's apparently working on a barber shop and a laundromat. Doesn't matter the size of the business. Just matters whether the math comes out the same." Marie studied him a moment, wiping flour off her hands onto an apron that had given up being any particular color a long time ago. "You're the man Marisol talked about," she said. "From the marina." "Word travels. This a small block, Mr. Ramble. Word travels here faster than the heat does." She refilled his coffee without asking, the 3rd refill of the morning, the bakery apparently operating on the same generous poor economics as every other small business on Palmetto Row. "You fix this, I name a pastry after you. You don't fix this, I probably still gonna be selling fritters somewhere, just maybe not here." The black pickup made its rounds on a rhythm Mike clocked by the 3rd week of sitting on benches and drinking too much coffee. Tuesdays and Fridays mid-morning, the same 2 men from the Mercado plus a rotating 3rd sometimes, working the block storefront by storefront in an order that never quite repeated, but always covered the same 6 businesses by lunch. He followed it on a Friday, 3 cars back through the first 2 turns, closing the gap only once traffic thinned out enough that losing it mattered more than being noticed. The truck made its last stop of the morning at a strip plaza anchor that used to be a Blockbuster, judging by the faded outline still visible on the stucco where letters had once been bolted on. Now home to a vape shop, a nail salon, and a storefront with butcher paper taped over the windows, and a hand-lettered sign reading "Coming Soon, Heritage Square Leasing Office," the paper gone yellow at the edges in a way that suggested soon had already missed its own deadline by several months. Eddie, the smaller collector, Mike had started thinking of him by the name Bobby Davis had supplied, since apparently everyone on the block knew these 2 by first name the way you know a weather pattern. Got out and went into the leasing office for 11 minutes by Mike's count, came back out with a folder, and the truck pulled out heading south instead of looping back toward Fort Pierce proper. Mike gave it 2 blocks of lead before he followed. The truck ran south on US 1 past a stretch of strip malls and a defunct drive-in theater whose screen still stood, blank and enormous, a relic nobody had bothered tearing down, then turned off onto a side road Mike didn't recognize, gravel kicking up under the truck's tires, and came to a stop in front of a self-storage facility, Sunrise Self-Storage, the sign read, orange roll-up doors running in 2 long rows behind a chain-link fence with a gate standing open, propped that way, Mike guessed, more out of habit than security. He parked across the road at a gas station that looked like it sold more lottery tickets than gasoline, nosed the truck in next to the air pump and watched. The black pickup pulled up to a unit near the middle of the 2nd row, door already raised, and a man stepped out from inside it to meet them, broad through the shoulders in a way that read as gym-built rather than work-built, close-cropped gray hair, wraparound sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead despite the glare, wearing a polo shirt with no logo, and the kind of khaki shorts a man wears when he wants you to think he's relaxed about his job. He held a clipboard of his own, different from Mercer's County Issue 1. This one just a plain metal clampboard with a legal pad clipped under the bar. Hank Dawson, Mike thought, with no real proof yet, beyond the obvious fit of the man directing two collectors like a foreman checking in a crew at the start of a shift. Eddie handed over the folder he'd picked up from the leasing office. Dawson flipped through it without much interest, said something Mike couldn't hear from across the road, and Eddie nodded along with the particular posture of a subordinate, absorbing instructions he didn't love but wasn't going to argue with. A second truck pulled up while Mike watched. Different crew entirely, two men he hadn't seen on Palmetto Row, and Dawson repeated roughly the same routine: clipboard out, a quick exchange, a folder or an envelope changing hands, the whole transaction taking less than 3 minutes before the second truck pulled back out and headed off in a direction Mike hadn't tracked. 2 crews. Maybe more he hadn't seen yet. Dawson standing in the open door of a storage unit like it was a job trailer, running collections off a clipboard, the way a foreman runs a roofing crew, multiple routes feeding back into one man at one fixed location on a schedule precise enough that Mike could have set a watch to it. This wasn't one guy leaning on one block. This was an operation with a payroll and a route sheet. Mike got out of the truck, slow, casual, the unhurried gait of a man who'd stopped for gas and a lottery ticket and nothing more, and walked toward the gas station's front door rather than toward the storage facility, buying himself a better angle without committing to anything that looked like surveillance to anybody glancing his way. Inside, the gas station smelled like motor oil and the specific chemical sweetness of a slushy machine that had been running too hot for too many hours. And a kid behind the counter who couldn't have been older than 19 looked up from a phone screen with the dead-eyed patience of someone working a shift that had several more hours left in it regardless of what happened in the parking lot. Help you? Lottery ticket. Whatever's cheap. Mike set a few dollars on the counter, kept his body angled toward the window, toward the storage facility across the road where Dawson still stood in the open unit's doorway, now talking on a phone of his own, one hand gesturing in a tight, controlled way that suggested the call wasn't going entirely his direction. "You know that storage place across the street?" Mike said, mostly to keep the kid talking, mostly to have a cover for staring out the window as long as he wanted to. "Sunrise?" "Yeah, my uncle rented a unit there for like a year. Place is fine, I guess. Some weird stuff goes on, though." The kid scratched the ticket Mike had bought without much enthusiasm, the universal motion of somebody who'd scratched 10,000 losing tickets and stopped expecting different. A lot of trucks come and go out of one unit, in particular. Same guy runs it, big dude, sunglasses on his head even when it's cloudy. "My uncle said the rent's cheap, 'cause the owner don't ask a lot of questions about what you're storing." "What's the owner's name?" "Don't know him." "Know the manager, kinda, lady named Sharon, works the front office. She's the one collects rent, does the paperwork." The kid shrugged, already losing interest, eyes drifting back toward his phone. "Anything else?" "That's it. Thanks." Mike walked back out into the heat, with a losing lottery ticket in his pocket, and a better picture forming in his head than he'd had 20 minutes ago, a fixed location. A manager named Sharon who handled paperwork legitimately enough to keep the facility's own books clean, and Hank Dawson running collections out of a rented unit like a man who'd learned, somewhere in a previous career, exactly how to keep an illegal operation looking boring enough that nobody bothered asking questions about it. He got back in the truck and sat a moment, not starting the engine yet, watching Dawson finish his phone call across the road, the tightness in the man's shoulders not fully releasing even after he'd hung up, the particular posture of somebody who'd just been told something he didn't like by somebody he couldn't afford to argue with. That was worth knowing, too. Whoever sat above Hank Dawson on whatever org chart ran this thing, the calls coming down weren't all good news. Mike reached for the key, And that was when Dawson's head turned, slow, scanning the road in front of the facility, the unhurried way a man scans a parking lot when something's nagging at the edge of his attention without quite registering as a specific threat yet. Past the gas station, past the air pump, settling for one long beat directly on the truck Mike sat in before sliding on, unbothered, apparently satisfied that a pickup truck idling at a gas pump wasn't worth a second thought. Mike let out a breath he hadn't noticed holding, and started the engine, and that was when his phone buzzed against the bench seat. The same unsaved number, no name attached, 3 words landing in his lap like a hand closing around his wrist from somewhere he couldn't see. Leave. Right now. He looked up from the screen. Across the road, Dawson had gone still again, phone back to his ear, but this time his eyes weren't scanning the parking lot anymore. They were locked, direct and unmistakable, on the gas station window Mike had been standing behind 10 minutes ago, and on the truck now idling 40 feet from where that window stood. Chapter 5. The kid behind the counter didn't look up again, and that turned out to matter more than anything else in the next 90 seconds, because it meant nobody inside the gas station registered the particular care with which Mike backed the truck out, instead of pulling forward, putting the building itself between his bumper and the storage facility's open gate for the 3 full seconds it took to get pointed the right direction. He didn't floor it. Flooring it told a man with a phone still pressed to his ear that the conversation he'd just had with whoever was on the other end mattered less than the truck pulling away from his pumps. And Mike had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to turn a maybe into a certainty was to drive like you had something to run from. He held the speed limit out to the highway, watched the mirror the whole stretch, and didn't see the black pickup, didn't see Dawson's own vehicle, didn't see anything behind him but a propane delivery truck and an old Buick driven by somebody who appeared to be using both lanes on principle. Whatever had occupied Dawson on that phone call had occupied him long enough that a pickup truck idling at a gas pump had time to become a pickup truck 3 miles gone, and Mike decided, somewhere around the turnpike overpass, that he'd take that kind of luck without asking too many questions about where it came from. His phone buzzed once more before he made the Colusa K line, the same unsaved number, and this text read different from the first 3, slower, almost an afterthought. Good. You listened. He didn't answer that one, either. Just drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, working through the short list of people who might be watching him closely enough to know, in real time, when he'd put himself somewhere stupid. Carol Jennings called that evening while Mike stood at his own stove burning eggs he hadn't meant to burn, too distracted by the day to mind the heat under the pan. Patricia Voss, she said, no greeting. The particular bluntness of a woman who'd spent her whole call budget on patience earlier that week and had none left over for pleasantries. Dead end. Tran ran it down for me as a favor on top of the favor. No relation to anybody interesting, far as state personnel records go. She's been county code enforcement director 11 years, came up from a planning department in Brevard. Husband's a retired school teacher. Common surname. I told you not to read too much into it. You told me. I read into it anyway. Everybody does. That's why coincidences get to ruin so many good Tuesday afternoons. A pause, papers shuffling somewhere on her end. Mercer's full citation history came through, though, and that part's not a dead end at all. 11 citations against your grocery store, 14 against 3 other properties on that same block over the same 8 weeks, and every single one of them traces, eventually, to a complaint logged by the same internal tracking number, a number that's supposed to belong to an anonymous tip line, except the tip line logs a callback number on every legitimate complaint, and these don't have one. So the complaints are fake. The complaints are administrative fiction. Somebody's logging fake tips to generate a paper trail that makes targeted harassment look like routine code enforcement responding to citizen concern. It's actually kind of elegant, in the way a fraud can be elegant right up until somebody pulls the thread. Jennings didn't sound like a woman admiring elegance exactly, more like a woman cataloging it for later use against the person who'd built it. I'll have more once Tran pulls who's got access to log those tip numbers internally. That's going to take another few days, on account of him doing all this on his own time, so it doesn't show up on anybody's radar as official interest. Appreciate it. Don't appreciate it yet. Appreciate it once it actually does something for Netu Lazo. Besides, give me something to read at my own kitchen table at 11 at night. She hung up without much more than that, the particular efficiency Mike had come to expect from her, leaving him standing over a pan of eggs that had gone from burnt to genuinely beyond saving. He scraped them into the trash and made toast instead, and ate it standing at the counter the way he ate most meals these days, and didn't think much more about Patricia Voss or anonymous tip lines for the rest of the evening, because his mind kept drifting instead to a number with no name attached and a message that had known exactly when to tell him to leave. She showed up a little after 9, no headlights announcing her the way a car usually announced itself on a street without curbs, which meant Mike heard footsteps on the gravel walk before he heard an engine at all, and had the porch light on, and his hand halfway to the drawer where he kept a pistol he hadn't drawn in 3 years before. He recognized, through the screen door's mesh, the shape of Jenny Baker standing on his front step in clothes that didn't fit the woman he remembered. No blazer. A plain cotton shirt, untucked, sleeves rolled past the elbow the way they'd been rolled at the diner, except this time it read less like a concession to heat and more like a woman who hadn't given much thought to what she put on that morning. Hair down instead of pulled back, a little wild at the ends like it had spent the day in a car with the windows cracked. No driver idling at the curb, no black sedan parked nose out for a clean exit. Just Jenny Baker, alone, standing in the gravel with her arms crossed against a chest that looked thinner than it had a month ago, like the last few weeks had taken something out of her she hadn't budgeted for losing. "You gonna make me stand here," she said, "or you gonna let me in before one of your neighbors decides I'm casing the place?" He opened the door. Inside, she stood a moment looking around the front room, the window unit rattling its complaint, the bananas going soft in the bowl on the counter, the crack in the ceiling that still ran from the light fixture to the corner like a river on a map, taking it in with an expression that wasn't quite judgment, more like a woman cataloging the details of a life she'd had a hand in shaping and was seeing in person for the first time. "This is smaller than I pictured. Built for one man and his junk. Both fit fine." "I see the junk part held up." She nodded toward the carport, visible through the side window, the Folgers cans stacked 3 deep against the wall. "You want to ask me why I'm here, or you want to make this harder on both of us by pretending it's a social call? Beer first. Then you tell me." He got 2 from the refrigerator, handed her one, and she took it without the lime he hadn't offered, drank a third of it, standing up before she said anything else, the particular thirst of a woman who hadn't had a quiet minute in longer than the bottle would account for. "My firm's done," she said finally. "Not done like a slow season. Done like somebody pulled a plug and watched the whole tank drain in about 4 days." "What happened?" "What happened is the client from your job, the one I never named, the one I'm still not gonna name tonight, so don't ask twice, cut every retainer I had running through that line of work. Not just the marina job. Everything. 3 other contracts I had open, completely unrelated work, all of it routed back through the same umbrella that paid for low tide, all of it canceled inside 1 week, no explanation. Just a wire that didn't show up when it was supposed to, and a phone call from a number I didn't recognize telling me my services were no longer required at this time." She said the last part with a bitter little twist, mimicking, Mike guessed, the exact phrasing somebody had used on her. "I built that piece of my business over 6 years, Mike. Careful work, Careful clients, the kind of reputation you don't get back once it's gone. And it took somebody 4 days to take it apart because I let you walk a banker's box out of a houseboat instead of handing it over clean. You're saying this is my fault. I'm saying it's the cost of the decision. And you made the decision, and I'm the one who's currently paying for it, which I think entitles me to at least be allowed to say so out loud in your kitchen. She drank again, longer this time, and some of the heat went out of her voice on the way down. I'm not here to make you feel guilty about Hayes. I'd probably make the same call again if I had it to make twice, knowing what I know now. I'm here because I think you're standing in the same kind of fire a second time, and I don't think you understand yet how hot it's actually burning. Mike leaned against the counter, beer untouched in one hand, watching her work through whatever she'd driven 2 hours to say. The way you watch a storm cell on radar, trying to figure which direction it's actually going to break. Fort Pierce, he said. You know about Fort Pierce. I know the name Hank Dawson. I know it the way you know a name that used to cross your desk at a company you no longer work for, which is to say, I knew it before I ever lost the marina contracts. And I've spent the last 2 weeks finding out a lot more about it than I wanted to know. She set the beer down on the counter, half finished, and crossed her arms again, the posture of a woman bracing for the part of the conversation she'd actually come to have. Dawson used to run private security contracts. Real ones, legitimate corporate stuff, before he got into something messier about 4 years back. Collections work, the kind that walks right up to the legal line and leans on it without quite stepping over. He's been on the payroll of the same network that paid Sandpiper for going on 3 years now, long before either one of us ever heard the name Tucker. What network, Jenny? I'm not supposed to say. You drove 2 hours to my house at 9 at night to tell me you're not supposed to say something. That's not a warning. That's a tease. Something flashed across her face. Not quite anger, closer to the specific frustration of a woman caught between 2 loyalties that had stopped being compatible the moment her own client cut her loose. She picked the beer back up, drank the rest of it in one long pull, and set the empty bottle down harder than the counter strictly deserved. Meridian Bridge, she said. There. You happy now? Never heard of it. Nobody's heard of it. That's the entire design. It's not a developer. It's not a pack. It's not even technically a company in the way Sandpiper or your Heritage Square are companies. It's a management layer, a consulting and advisory shop that sits above the shells, structures the deals, hires the appraisers, hires the collection crews, hires firms like mine to do the quiet legwork nobody else can trace. Meridian Bridge doesn't own anything. Meridian Bridge just makes sure everybody who does own something gets paid through the same handful of accounts, structured the same handful of ways, so that no individual piece of the machine ever has to know what the whole machine's actually doing. She said it fast, the words coming out of her like something she'd been holding back with both hands and had just stopped being able to hold. I signed my original retainer 6 years ago with an entity called Meridian Bridge Advisors. I thought it was a boring name for a boring back-office consulting shop. I have spent 6 years doing exactly the kind of work I do best, getting paid well and on time, never once asking the question I should have asked the very first week, which is who actually sits at the top of an advisory firm that advises this many different shells in this many different states. Mike set his own beer down, untouched, the cold condensation already pooling a ring on the counter beneath it. And Reynolds. The name landed on her the way it had landed on Roger Hammond at El Faro, a flinch she didn't fully manage to suppress, fast, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but real. I don't know a Reynolds, she said, too quick. The kind of too quick that told Mike everything the sentence itself didn't. Sure you don't. I don't know him. I know the name's come up. I know it's come up enough times, in enough rooms I wasn't technically supposed to be standing in, that I've learned not to say it out loud where anybody official might be listening." She rubbed at her own face with one hand, a gesture that aged her 10 years in the porch light coming through the window. "Mike, I am telling you things right now that could get me hurt worse than losing 4 contracts in a week. I need you to understand that. This isn't me being dramatic for effect. This is me standing in your kitchen, because some part of me apparently still cares whether you walk into something you can't walk back out of. And I would like that part of me to shut up and let me drive home, except it won't, so here I am. Then tell me the rest." "There isn't a rest I can give you tonight." She straightened up off the counter, the posture of a woman deciding, mid-sentence, that she'd already said more than she meant to and needed to leave before she said the part that would actually cost her something irreversible. "Walk away from Fort Pierce, Mike. I mean that as plainly as I know how to mean anything. Dawson's not Eddie and his partner shoving an old man around for a cleaning fee. Dawson's the kind of man Meridian Bridge sends in when the soft approach has already failed and somebody upstairs has decided the deadline matters more than the optics. You poked Sandpiper, and it bled slow enough that you and that detective friend of yours got to walk away clean. This one's not going to bleed slow. I can feel it from 2 hours away, and I haven't even been standing on that block. Earl Tucker's marina is still standing because I didn't walk away. Earl Tucker's marina is still standing because the people running that piece of it decided the cost of cleaning up the mess wasn't worth what they'd already lost." Jenny's voice had gone tight now, urgent in a way Mike hadn't heard from her since the second phone call, the one where she'd asked him about the box and not about Hayes. Meridian Bridge doesn't make that calculation the same way every time. Sometimes the math says walk away. Sometimes the math says clean it up the hard way, fast before it costs anything else. I don't know which math they're running on Fort Pierce yet, and that's exactly why I'm telling you to get out of the blast radius until somebody smarter than either one of us figures it out. Her phone rang. It rang loud in the small kitchen. An actual ringtone instead of a buzz, something generic and tinny that didn't match the woman holding it. And Jenny looked down at the screen, and whatever name or number sat there took every bit of color out of her face inside of 1 second flat. "I have to go," she said, already moving toward the door, the phone still ringing in her hand unanswered. "Jenny." "I have to go, Mike." She had the screen door open before he'd finished saying her name, and on the porch step she stopped just for a second, the ringing phone finally going silent in her hand as whoever was calling gave up or the call dropped on its own. And she looked back at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in 3 years of knowing her, something that looked for the first time since the diner booth, almost like fear instead of control. "Lock your door tonight," she said. "Actually, lock it. Not the screen, the real one." "Who was that?" "Nobody you need to worry about yet." She was already down the steps, moving fast across the gravel toward a car parked at the curb that Mike hadn't even registered arriving. A gray sedan, not the black one, not a rental sticker visible from this distance. And the detail landed on him with a small cold weight, even as the rest of the moment was moving too fast to fully process. "I'll call you when I can. Don't call me first. Jenny." She didn't stop again. The sedan's engine started before she'd fully closed the door, and it pulled away from the curb with its headlights coming on a half-second late, the exact same half-second delay Mike remembered from a different gray car in a different parking lot. And he stood on his own front step in the dark watching taillights shrink down a street without curbs, his beer still sitting half-finished on the kitchen counter behind him, the name Meridian Bridge sitting heavier in his chest than the heat of the evening had any right to make anything feel. He went back inside and locked the real door the way she'd told him to, and stood at the window a long while after, watching the empty street, waiting for a sound that never came. Chapter 6. The library's third terminal had a new sign taped above it since Mike's last visit. Please limit sessions to 45 minutes, thank you, which he ignored on the strength of being the only person in the building who wasn't a teenager doing summer reading credit, and pulled up the Florida Division of Corporation's site, with Marisol leaning over his shoulder close enough that he could smell the coffee shop smell baked permanently into her clothes. Heritage Square Holdings, LLC, she read off the screen before he'd finished typing it. Filed when? Working on it. The search resolved, and there it sat. Filed 14 months back, registered agent listed at a Wilmington, Delaware suite number that Mike recognized on sight, now the way you recognize a relative's handwriting. Manager field blank. Authorized member field blank. The exact same architecture as Sandpiper, down to the particular shade of bureaucratic invisibility. Except this filing had come from a different registered agent firm than the one he'd traced a month ago. Same state, same kind of mailbox and fax machine operation, just a different name on the door. Different agent, Marisol said. Doesn't that mean it's not the same people? Means whoever's running this learned something from watching what happened up north. Spread the paperwork across 2 agents instead of 1, so nobody pulls a single thread and gets the whole sweater. Mike searched the new agent's suite address the way he'd searched the first one a month ago, and 3 more LLCs came back filed within 6 weeks of Heritage Square, none of them famous, none of them with a website worth the bandwidth. Palmetto Acquisitions. Sunrise Property Partners. Coastal Crown Holdings. There it is. 4 shells this round, same as last time. Different coat, same hand. Sunrise, Marisol said, sitting up straighter. That's the storage place. Sunrise Self-Storage, where Hank runs his cruise out of. Different Sunrise. Probably. Wouldn't bet money on the coincidence not meaning something, though. Mike clicked through to the property appraiser's site next. The same county records dance he'd run with Susan Phillips a month back. Except this time he didn't need a county clerk's generosity to walk him through it. He knew exactly what pattern he was hunting for and exactly where to look for it. Coastal Crown Holdings had bought the building 2 doors down from the bakery, vacant for years, sale price suspiciously specific. Sunrise Property Partners had bought the old Blockbuster strip plaza outright, explaining, Mike now understood, why a butcher paper leasing office for Heritage Square sat inside a building technically owned by a different shell entirely. The whole arrangement a shell renting space inside another shell, nesting dolls all the way down. Palmetto Acquisitions hadn't bought anything yet, near as the records showed, which told Mike it existed purely as a vehicle waiting for a signature that hadn't happened. And every single appraisal, attached to every closing, carried the same name at the bottom of the page. Whitcomb again? Marisol said, before he'd even finished scrolling to it. Whitcomb again. She sat back from the screen, arms crossed, jaw working at something. So it's not just the same playbook. It's literally the same people doing the math. Same appraiser, same architecture, same registered agent family. Probably the same lawyer drafting the boilerplate language if anybody ever bothered pulling that thread too. Mike closed out of the corporation's search and pulled up the county's GIS parcel map instead, the satellite view loading slow over library Wi-Fi. 6 blocks of Palmetto Row rendering pixel by pixel like something developing in a darkroom. Look at the footprint. She leaned in. The parcels, Coastal Crown and Sunrise Property Partners, and the rest had already acquired didn't scatter randomly across the map. They ran in a tight, deliberate line. The vacant building, the old Blockbuster Plaza, 2 more storefronts that had apparently changed hands in the last year without anybody on the block mentioning it to Mike directly, all of it forming a corridor that started at the south end of Palmetto Row and crept north 1 parcel at a time, like a tide coming in slow enough that nobody standing on the beach noticed the water until it had already reached their feet. And at the very top of that corridor, the last unclaimed parcel standing between the developer's footprint and whatever lay past the block's north edge, sat a building with a hand-painted sign in the window advertising fresh Cuban bread. "It's not random," Marisol said, quiet now, the anger from a minute ago gone somewhere colder. "We're not just one grocery store that happened to get unlucky. We're the last domino." "Looks that way." "Why us, specifically? Why does the corridor end at my grandfather's building and not somebody else's?" Mike pulled up the parcel maps layer showing zoning designations, a feature he hadn't known the county GIS system had, until he stumbled into it scrolling for something else, and there it was. Lazo's Mercado sat on the one corner lot in the whole corridor, zoned for a curb cut wide enough to handle commercial truck access onto the cross street behind it. The kind of detail that meant nothing to anybody selling bread and everything to somebody planning a development that would eventually need trucks moving in and out of it. "Access," Mike said. "Your corner's got the only lot on this whole stretch that can take a real driveway onto the back street without tearing out somebody's parking lot to do it. Whatever they're building, it needs your corner to actually function. The rest of this corridor's just real estate. Your building's infrastructure." Marisol sat with that a long moment, staring at a satellite photo of her own family's roof from 400 feet up, the kind of view that turned a life's work into a single gray rectangle on a screen. "That's almost worse," she said finally. "Knowing it's not personal. Knowing we're not even the target. We're just the last piece of pipe they need to lay before the water runs through clean. Personal or not, it's the reason they can't just walk away the way Sandpiper eventually did with Earl's Marina. They need this corner. That's leverage, same as it cuts against your grandfather, but it cuts the other direction too. A development that can't function without one specific parcel means the people running it have got exactly as much riding on this fight as your grandfather does." They drove back to the Mercado in Mike's truck, Marisol's own car having developed a transmission problem 2 weeks back that she'd been nursing along rather than paying to fix, and found Netu behind the register exactly where Mike had left him 3 days running. Except today he had company. A man Mike didn't recognize, mid-40s, wearing a Gayabera nicer than Nito's own, and carrying himself with the particular stillness of somebody who'd come to deliver news he didn't enjoy delivering. "Mike," Marisol said low the second they came through the door, and she registered the visitor's face. "That's Hector. Family friend. Does some accounting for my grandfather, has for years." Hector looked up at them with the expression of a man relieved to have an excuse to stop talking. And Netu, behind the register, had the particular grayness in his face that Mike had learned over the last month to recognize as a man receiving news his body was processing faster than his mind wanted to allow. "Tell them," Netu said. "Tell them what you just told me." Hector glanced between Mike and Marisol, clearly recalibrating who exactly he was now explaining this to. "The lease on the building," he said. "I went back through it last week, after Marisol called asking about the original purchase paperwork. There's a balloon clause in the original 1979 mortgage your grandfather refinanced back in 2009. Most people never look at refinance paperwork again once the payments start. Why would they? But there's a clause requiring full payoff or renegotiation if the property's assessed value changes by more than 40% within any 12-month period. "Whitcomb's appraisal," Marisol said, already 3 steps ahead of him. "Whitcomb's appraisal," Hector confirmed, "valued the building at less than half what it was worth 18 months ago. Citation history, the so-called blight from unresolved code violations, all of it factored into a number that's now low enough to trigger that clause. The bank's required, under the original terms, to call the balance due in full or force a renegotiation at current market terms within 90 days of being notified." "Notified by who?" Mike said. "By the appraisal firm itself. Whitcomb filed the updated assessment directly with the lender 3 weeks ago. I only found the notice because I was already digging through old paperwork." Netu didn't even know it had been sent. Hector's voice had the careful, apologetic flatness of a man delivering a diagnosis nobody asked for and nobody wanted. The 90 days runs out in 19 days. If he can't pay off the remaining balance in full, or qualify for new financing at a market rate that's gone up considerably since 2009, the bank forecloses. And Heritage Square's letter, the buyout offer, that number on the table is almost exactly what the foreclosure payoff would leave him with after the bank takes its cut. Maybe less. The radio behind the counter kept playing its low horn music, oblivious, and Mike understood, standing there in the smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread, that he'd been wrong 3 days ago when he told Netu and Marisol he knew the shape of this fight. He'd known the shape of Sandpiper's version. This one had a clock built into it that Earl Tucker's never had. No commission vote to derail, no developer pitch to discredit at a town hall, just a banking covenant ticking down to a date nobody on this side of the counter had known existed until 20 minutes ago. 19 days, Netu said, mostly to himself, the words coming out small. I have until 19 days, whether I sign their letter or not. You're 3 weeks from a forced sale, Mike said. Sign or don't sign. Either way, the clock's already running. I didn't know, Netu said. And the particular devastation in his voice wasn't about the money, Mike understood, not really. It was about the discovery that the trap had been built and sprung months before he'd even known to look for it. That every week he'd spent paying fines and cleaning fees, telling himself he was managing the problem. The actual mechanism that would take his building had already been filed with a bank and was simply waiting, patient and procedural, for its own deadline to arrive. Marisol had gone very still beside Mike. The legal pad and the color-coded folders and 2 months of careful documentation suddenly looking, in the wake of Hector's news, like the wrong kind of evidence entirely. Proof of harassment, when what they actually needed, in 19 days, was proof of fraud serious enough to undo a balloon clause before a bank's own internal calendar made the question moot. Can we fight the appraisal itself? Mike said, looking at Hector. Get an independent one, fast. Show the bank Whitcomb's number was cooked. Maybe. Banks aren't required to accept a counter-appraisal, but most will at least pause a foreclosure clock if there's a credible dispute filed before the deadline, especially if there's documentation suggesting the original appraisal was fraudulent rather than just generous. Hector said it, with the careful hedging of a man who didn't want to promise something he couldn't deliver. You'd need it filed fast, and you'd need the bank's loan officer to actually care enough to read it, instead of just running out the clock on autopilot, which banks do plenty of when nobody's pushing back. I know somebody who pushes back for a living, Mike said. Carol Jennings answered on the second ring, and Mike laid out the balloon clause and the 19 days and the Whitcomb appraisal filed straight to a lender 3 weeks ago without anybody on the other end of the transaction knowing it existed, and she was quiet on the line long enough that he could hear, faint behind her, the sound of a television playing somewhere in her own house, a different texture than the office's fluorescent hum. That's not code enforcement harassment anymore, she said finally. That's bank fraud. If Whitcomb knowingly filed a cooked number to trigger a loan covenant on behalf of a buyer who benefits from the foreclosure. That's federal territory, potentially, wire fraud, bank fraud, the kind of charge that doesn't care what county you're standing in when you file it. Which means it might get flagged and buried same as your case did. Might. Or might move faster precisely, because it's got a hard deadline. Nobody can quietly continue twice without somebody noticing a family lost their building while the file sat in a drawer. Papers shuffling again on her end. The particular sound of a woman reaching for a legal pad, even at home, even off the clock. 19 days isn't long enough to build the case the slow, careful way I built the Sandpiper file. We're going to have to move faster and louder than I'm comfortable with, which means we skip some of the quiet documentation phase and go straight at Whitcomb and Mercer both, hard, and hope one of them breaks before the bank's clock runs out. Hammond broke in about a week last time. Hammond's a salesman with a conscience he hadn't used in years. Whitcomb's an appraiser who's been running this exact fraud for at least 2 developments now, without anybody laying a hand on him. That's a different kind of confidence to crack. She exhaled, long, the sound of a woman doing math she didn't love the answer to. I'll call Tran again in the morning, see if the tip line access records are ready early. I'll also reach out to a contact at the state's Office of Financial Regulation. Appraiser licensing falls under them, and a fraudulent appraisal filed to trigger a foreclosure is exactly the kind of thing that gets a license pulled fast if somebody with the right title decides to care. And if nobody decides to care in 19 days. Then, Netu Lazo loses his building to a bank covenant, while we're all still very busy being right about everything else. Jennings didn't dress it up softer than that, and Mike respected her for it, even while the sentence sat heavy in his chest. Get me everything Hector's got on that refinance paperwork tonight. Every page, every date stamp. I want it on my desk before Whitcomb's office opens tomorrow morning, because the only way this clock works in our favor is if we make more noise than they can quietly manage in 19 days, and noise needs paper to back it up. She hung up, and Mike stood in the Mercado's back office, a cramped room behind the curtain that smelled like old invoices and floor wax. Nito's small desk crowded with receipts going back further than the filing system seemed designed to handle. Watching Marisol photograph every page of the refinance file on her phone, hands moving fast and sure despite everything else about the day, the particular focus of someone who'd finally been handed a fight with an actual shape to it instead of just a slow, formless dread. Netu sat in the corner on a folding chair, watching his granddaughter work, and when Mike caught his eye, the old man managed something that wasn't quite a smile, but was trying hard to be one. 19 days, Netu said. 45 years I had this building, and it comes down to 19 days. We're not out of moves yet. No. Netu looked at the stacks of receipts on his desk. 40-some years of a life rendered into paper nobody outside this room would ever care about, except that somewhere in the last 3 weeks it had quietly become the only thing standing between him and a foreclosure clock that had been ticking since before he even knew to look for it. But I think, Mr. Ramble, we are running out of them faster than I like. Chapter 7. Marisol was already sweeping when Mike pulled up, glass crunching under a broom that wasn't built for the job. A drift of it caught in the gap between the sidewalk and the storefront where the wind had pushed it overnight. The front window of Lazo's Mercado had a hole in it the size of a softball, spider-webbed cracks running out from the center in every direction, and the canned goods pyramid that Netu had built with such care had taken a glancing hit from whatever came through. 3 rows of tomato sauce scattered across the floor inside, one can split open and bleeding red across the tile in a way that looked for one bad half-second from the street like something it wasn't. Found it like this at 6, Marisol said, not looking up from the broom. Bricks still in there. Cops already came and went. Took a photo, said they'd file a report. Told my grandfather property crime's down 12% this year, like that's supposed to make him feel better about his own window. Which cops? Fort Pierce, not your detective friend. Young guy. Polite. Didn't ask a single question about who might want to do this, which tells me everything about how seriously anybody's gonna take it. She swept the last of the glass into a dustpan and dumped it into a trash bag already half full, the morning's second load. Insurance is gonna cover maybe 60% of the window. The deductible's $200. Same number as the cleaning fee. I noticed that too. She set the broom against the doorframe and looked at him with an expression that had stopped being scared somewhere overnight and turned into something flatter and more dangerous. 15 days now. I moved the calendar to where Abuelo can see it from the register. Figured, If he's going to live with the clock running, he should at least be able to look at it instead of just feeling it. Inside, Netu worked the register with the particular slowness of a man who'd already replaced one window in his head a dozen times before the glass company even called back with a quote. And he didn't look up when Mike came through what was left of the door. "I heard about Bobby too," Netu said before Mike asked. "You should go see him. He's not opening today." Bobby Davis's shop sat dark at 10 in the morning. The open sign turned to face the glass instead of the street, and Mike found him inside anyway, sweeping his own floor though nothing on it looked broken, the particular busywork of a man who needed his hands occupied more than he needed the floor actually clean. "They didn't break nothing of mine," Bobby said before Mike got a question out. "Just me." He set the broom down and rolled his sleeve up past the elbow, and the bruise running along his forearm had already gone the deep mottled purple that told Mike it'd be 3 different colors by the weekend. Another one sat high on his cheekbone, not as dark yet, the kind that takes a day to announce itself fully. Closing up last night. 2 fellas, never seen either one before. Not Eddie, not Eddie's partner, somebody new. Bigger. Quiet. Didn't say nothing about cleaning fees or service charges. Didn't say nothing at all, really. Except one of them put a hand flat on my chest and walked me back into the doorframe hard enough to crack the wood, and the other one said, real calm, like he was reading off a card, "Tell your friend the spy to mind his own business." The words landed somewhere in Mike's chest he hadn't braced for, a weight that didn't have anything to do with the bruise itself. "That's on me, Bobby. It's on whoever swung the door into my arm, which wasn't you." Bobby picked the broom back up, more for something to hold than anything left to sweep. "I'm not blaming you, Mr. Ramble. I'm just telling you what happened, because I figure you'd rather know than not know. You call it in." Called it in. Same young fella came by, took a report, asked was I sure I didn't recognize either man, which I wasn't, on account of it being dark, and one of 'em standing where the streetlight don't reach on purpose, I'd guess. Bobby's hand drifted to the bruise on his cheek, touched it light, winced. 61 years old, Mr. Ramble. I've been cutting hair on this block 40 years, and never once had a man put hands on me, till 2 weeks after you walked in talking to Netu. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying I don't know how many more Saturdays of this I got left in me before I start thinking different about staying open. He drove to Colusa Cay that afternoon, mostly to put his hands on a wrench at Tucker's Marina and let the work settle the part of his head that wanted to drive straight to the Sunrise self-storage facility and start asking Hank Dawson questions with his fists instead of his patience, which would have solved exactly nothing and cost plenty. Earl found him under the fuel dock fitting that had apparently developed a second leak, in sympathy with the first, and didn't ask what was wrong, just handed him the right size wrench without being asked, and let the work happen in the kind of silence 2 men share when one of them's already decided he doesn't need to know everything to know enough. "You're not here for the boat," Earl said eventually. "I'm here for the boat." "Sure you are." Earl wiped his hands on the rag that had outlived several previous owners. "Whatever it is, you go handle it smarter than you handled my dock. I still got a sore back from swinging that boat hook, and I'm guessing whoever you're up against this time learned the same lesson you did about a fair fight not staying fair." Mike thought about Bobby Davis's cracked door frame and the words, "Tell your friend the spy to mind his own business," and didn't say anything. And Earl, watching his face do whatever it was doing, just nodded once like the silence had answered the question well enough. He went back to Fort Pierce after dark, not in his own truck, borrowed Marisol's, the one with the bad transmission, parked it 3 blocks off Palmetto Row, in a spot that didn't put a stranger's vehicle anywhere near the block's regular foot traffic, and walked in on foot, slow, the same unhurried gait he'd used clocking a man's coffer in El Faro a week ago. Except tonight the gate was doing actual reconnaissance instead of theater. The block at 11 at night looked different than it ever did in daylight. the bakery's oven light still glowing faint through Marie's back window where she'd be up till 1 finishing dough for the morning, the barbershop dark and shuttered, the laundromat's fluorescent tubes humming over rows of empty machines, Diane Walker's chair by the front window vacant for once, the whole strip gone quiet in the particular way small commercial blocks go quiet once the last regular's gone home, and the only light left belongs to whoever's working too hard to sleep on schedule. Mike found a recessed doorway across from the laundromat, an accountant's office that closed at 5, deep enough in shadow that a man standing still in it became part of the building rather than a shape worth a second look, and settled in to wait with the patience of 20 years spent doing exactly this in places considerably less pleasant than a Florida summer night. He almost missed them. That was the thing about good muscle. The bad kind announced itself with a truck engine and a swagger. The good kind arrived quiet, on foot. 2 shapes peeling off from a parked sedan half a block down that Mike hadn't clocked until it was already empty. Bigger than Eddie's crew. Moved with the same disciplined economy Mike remembered from the 2 men on Earl Tucker's dock a month ago. Not amateurs leaning on scared shopkeepers, professionals running a different kind of job tonight. The kind where breaking something mattered more than collecting something. They went for the laundromat's front window first, one of them already pulling something from a jacket pocket. Not a brick this time, something with more weight to it, a length of pipe maybe. And Mike came out of the doorway already moving fast and low, his phone up and recording before his feet had finished crossing the street. He didn't announce himself. Didn't give them the chance to set up the way the Jim-built one on Tucker's dock had gotten to set up. Didn't let this turn into the kind of close, ugly grapple that had left his cheek bruised and his pride dented a month ago. He came in from the blind side, the angle they hadn't bothered checking, because nobody checks a recessed doorway across a dark street at 11 at night, and put his shoulder into the nearer one's lower back hard enough to drive him face first into the laundromat's brick facade before either man had finished registering a third party existed. The pipe clattered to the sidewalk. The second one spun fast, hands already coming up, and stopped just for a half second, recognizing something in Mike's stance that the first one hadn't had time to recognize before his face met brick. And that half second was the whole fight. Mike stepped into the space the hesitation left him, caught the man's wrist before the half-raised hands could finish becoming a guard, and turned it the way 20 years in a dozen training rooms had taught him to turn a wrist when a man's weight was already leaning the wrong direction. Not a strike, just leverage, physics doing the work instead of force. And walked him down to the sidewalk controlled, no wasted motion, the whole thing taking less time than it had taken the pipe to finish rolling into the gutter. "Phone," Mike said, keeping the wrist locked, his own phone still recording in his other hand, propped now against the doorway's frame where it could see both men at once. On the ground. Slow. The man on the ground didn't fight it, breathing hard through his nose, weighing the math the way Eddie's partner had weighed it on Tucker's dock. Except this time there wasn't a second move available to weigh, just the simple fact of a wrist held at an angle that would break before it would let go. The first one had recovered enough to push off the brick, blood running from a split lip, and looked at his partner pinned in his pipe in the gutter, and made the only decision available to a professional who just watched the job go sideways in under 10 seconds. He ran. Mike let him go. Chasing meant letting go of the wrist he had, and the wrist he had was worth considerably more than a sprint down a dark street he didn't know as well as the man running it. "Dawson send you," Mike said, quiet, conversational, the tone he used to use in rooms where volume cost you information instead of buying it. "Or somebody send Dawson, and Dawson sent you." The man on the ground didn't answer. Mike adjusted the angle a degree, not enough to break anything, enough to make the man's breath catch. "I'm not asking twice." "Dawson," the man said, the word coming out tight, more grunt than word. "Just Dawson. Don't know nothing past that. I swear to Christ, I just do the job he gives me." "What was tonight's job?" "Window. Maybe the machines, if we had time." A pause, the man's eyes flicking toward the phone propped in the doorway, understanding a half-second too late exactly how much trouble this particular night had just turned into. Wasn't supposed to be nobody here. Wasn't supposed to be a problem. It's a problem now. He held the man another minute, long enough to be sure the first one wasn't circling back with reinforcements, and let go only once he heard, faint, and then not faint at all, a siren coming up the block from the direction of the station. Diane Walker, it turned out, hadn't been entirely asleep upstairs over her own shop, had heard the pipe hit the sidewalk, and called it in before Mike had finished walking the second man down. A patrol car rolled up with its light bar going, but no siren now, cutting the noise the last block in, and a young officer got out fast, hand near his hip, taking in the scene, one man sitting against a brick wall with a bloodied lip rapidly receding into the dark, one man kneeling on the sidewalk with his wrist still loosely held, a pipe in the gutter, a phone propped in a doorway still recording, with the particular widening of the eyes that told Mike this wasn't a cop who'd walked into a scene like this very often. "Hands where I can see 'em," the officer said to both of them, voice cracking up half an octave on the last word before he caught it. Mike raised his free hand slow, let go of the wrist the rest of the way, stepped back 2 paces with his palms open. "I called this in," he said, which wasn't strictly true, but Diane had, and the lie cost nothing, and bought a half-second of de-escalation he needed. "You did not call this in," the officer said, recovering some composure, badge catching the streetlight. Dale Foster, the name tag read. Dispatch logged the call from the laundromat owner. "Who are you?" "Mike Ramble. I've been working with Netu Lazo, down the block. And Detective Carol Jennings, Colusa KPD, if you want to call and confirm any of that." Something shifted in Foster's face at the name. Not the cable news recognition Mike had gotten used to from strangers on the beach, something more specific, the recognition of a working cop who'd already heard the name secondhand from somewhere official. "Jennings called our shift sergeant a week back," Foster said, slow, working through it. "Asked some questions about Frank Mercer's citation history. Sergeant mentioned it at roll call. Said some Martin County detective was sniffing around our code enforcement on a hunch." "That you?" "That's me. Sniffing, mostly. Tonight it stopped being a hunch." Foster looked at the man still kneeling, at the pipe in the gutter, at the recessed doorway where Mike's phone still recorded a scene that had nothing left in it worth recording. And something in his posture loosened by a degree. The particular release of a man who'd been carrying a private suspicion for a while and had just been handed permission to stop carrying it quietly. "I've seen these guys before," Foster said, quieter now, almost to himself. "Different truck, same kind of build, cruising this block 2-3 times a week for 2 months. Never had cause to stop 'em. Never had a single thing to write down that wasn't just a feeling." He pulled his radio off his shoulder, called for backup and an ambulance both, then looked back at Mike with an expression that had hardened into something useful. "I'm gonna need your phone. The recording. And I'm gonna need you to walk me through every single thing you just told me. Slow, because I think I've been driving past the actual crime for 2 months thinking it was just a couple guys who looked like trouble and never quite were. Fine by me. And the fella who ran. You get a name, a description, anything?" "Didn't get a name. Got a face, briefly. Got this one's name for who sent him." Mike nodded toward the man on the ground, who'd gone quiet now, the particular stillness of somebody calculating exactly how much worse the night was about to get for him personally. "Dawson. Hank Dawson. Runs crews out of a storage unit on US 1, Sunrise, self-storage, 2nd row, middle of the block." Foster wrote it down without being asked twice, the pen moving fast across a notepad that had clearly seen less urgent use most nights, and Mike watched the young officer's face settle into the particular focus of a man who'd just been handed the one piece of paperwork that actually mattered after months of paperwork that hadn't. "You've been sitting on a feeling about this block a while," Mike said. Longer than I should have, probably. Citations that didn't track. Complaints that didn't have a callback number. 2 guys cruising past the same 6 storefronts on the same 2 days every week like they were running a route. Foster looked down the block toward the laundromat's broken window, that almost was, toward the Mercado further up where a different window had already gone through 2 nights ago, and something tired and a little angry crossed his face. Kept telling myself it wasn't my call to make. Above my pay grade. Figure out who's behind something that organized. Turns out, the call was never that complicated. Just needed somebody to write it down. A second patrol car pulled up, then an ambulance not far behind it, lights stacking up red and blue against the dark storefronts in a way that pulled half the block's residents out onto their stoops despite the hour. Diane Walker first, then Marie Joseph still in her apron. Flour dusted up one forearm, then Bobby Davis limping out in pajama pants with the bruise on his cheekbone gone fully purple under the patrol lights. And finally Marisol, who must have heard it from 3 blocks away or gotten a call from somebody, jogging up the sidewalk with her hair still wet from a shower she'd clearly cut short. "What happened?" she said, breathless, looking at the man being walked to a patrol car in cuffs, at Mike standing in the recessed doorway retrieving his phone from Officer Foster's outstretched hand, at the whole strange tableau of red and blue light washing over a block that 2 months ago had never seen a single police report filed against it in 6 years. "Tonight," Mike said, "we get something on paper that isn't a fake complaint logged under an anonymous tip number." Foster looked over at that, notepad still open, and something almost like a grim smile crossed his face. "Yeah," he said. "Tonight we do." He turned to walk toward his car, radio already back up to his shoulder, calling in something to dispatch that Mike couldn't fully make out over the ambulance's idling engine, but he caught one phrase clear before Foster's voice faded into the general noise of the block finally, fully waking up to what had been happening to it for months. "Need a detective from Martin County on the line. Tonight, if she's awake. Tell her Fort Pierce just opened a file she's gonna want to see." Chapter 8. Frank Mercer's house sat in a development called Citrus Trace, 11 minutes off US 1, the kind of subdivision where every third house had the same floor plan, flipped left to right, and every lawn looked like it had been mowed by the same crew on the same Tuesday. Jennings parked 2 doors down rather than directly in front, the old habit of a cop who liked the option of watching a driveway without announcing she was watching it. And Mike sat in the passenger seat of her unmarked sedan running through, one more time, exactly how much of what they had was paper, and exactly how much was still just shape. "He's not Hammond," Jennings said for the 3rd time since Colusa K, the reminder apparently as much for herself as for Mike. "Hammond sold dirt for a living, and had a guilty conscience 3 drinks deep before we ever sat down. Mercer's a civil servant, who's convinced himself he's the one following the rules, and everybody else is the problem. That kind of man doesn't fold from shame. He folds from proof, and only if the proof's specific enough that denying it makes him look stupid instead of just guilty." "You got specific." "I got specific enough to make a try." Tran came through with the tip line access logs this morning. She tapped a folder on the console between them, the same kind of thin manila stock Marisol favored, though Jennings's version had tabs color-coded in a system entirely her own. Every fake complaint logged against Lazo's, against the laundromat, against the barbershop, every single one of them entered into the system from the same terminal, same login credentials. Mercer's own. He logged the fake complaints against himself. He logged the fake complaints into a queue that then assigned him the follow-up inspection, which tells me one of 2 things. Either he's dumber than a man needs to be to hold a county job for 9 years, or he didn't think anybody'd ever pull access logs on an anonymous tip line, because why would they? It's anonymous. Jennings closed the folder, looked at the house 2 doors down with its flag mailbox and its rock garden, and its single hanging fern doing its level best against the heat. "I'm betting on the second one. Confident men get sloppy, in exactly this specific way. Mercer answered the door in a county polo shirt, despite it being a Saturday, like the uniform had stopped being a uniform and become simply what he wore. And his face did the particular drop a man's face does when a detective's badge shows up on his own front step instead of staying safely contained inside a workday he controlled. "Detective," he said. "This about Tuesday's call. I already filed the—" "Not about Tuesday," Jennings said. "Got a few minutes, Mr. Mercer? Inside's fine. Don't need to do this on the lawn for your neighbor's benefit, unless you'd rather." He let them in. The house smelled like fabric softener and something simmering in a slow cooker, a wife's voice calling out from somewhere upstairs asking who was at the door. Mercer calling back, "Work thing, hun, give me a minute," in the careful, even tone of a man already rehearsing how he'd explain this later, assuming there was a later that didn't involve explaining it from somewhere considerably less comfortable. They sat at his kitchen table, and Jennings laid the access logs out flat between them, unhurried, letting Mercer's eyes find the pattern himself rather than walking him through it line by line. "Those are tip-line records," she said. "Pulled by a colleague of mine in St. Lucie Sheriff's, completely above board. Nothing here that needed a warrant since they're county's own administrative logs, and you don't have a privacy expectation on your own work terminal. 11 complaints against Lazo's Mercado, 14 more against 3 other Palmetto Row businesses, all of them logged from your login, all of them missing the callback number that's supposed to accompany a legitimate anonymous tip." Mercer's face did several things in quick succession. Confusion first, genuine. The look of a man scrambling to remember a detail he hadn't thought mattered enough to remember carefully. Then something closer to understanding. The dawning shape of a trap he hadn't seen built around him until he was already standing inside it. Then, last, the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of his own confusion he was willing to let show. "I don't log complaints," he said. "I respond to complaints. There's a difference. There's a difference when somebody else logs them. There's a much smaller difference when the same login that responds to the complaint is the same login that created it." Jennings tapped the timestamp column, patient. "Walk me through how that happens, Mr. Mercer. If it's not you sitting at your own desk, typing in a fake complaint against a building you're about to go inspect. Somebody else has access to that terminal sometimes. Shared login, it happens. It's been promising to fix that for 2 years. Who else?" Mercer didn't answer that one right away, and the silence ran long enough that Mike, sitting quiet at the edge of the table the way Jennings had asked him to, watched the man's hands find each other under the table, fingers working against each other in a small, unconscious knot. "You ever meet a man named Hank Dawson?" Jennings said, into the silence. The knot of fingers under the table went still. "I don't know that name." "That's interesting, because Dawson's name came up 4 times last night in a statement from a man currently sitting in St. Lucie County booking, charged with aggravated assault on Palmetto Row, after he and a partner attacked a barbershop owner with intent to do property damage at a laundromat 2 doors down." Jennings let that land, watching Mercer's face the whole time. "Same block you've cited 11 times in 8 weeks for violations that didn't exist before May. Same block where a Cuban grocery's getting foreclosed on in 14 days because your friend Whitcomb filed an appraisal so far below market value it triggered a balloon clause nobody bothered telling the owner existed. I don't know anything about a foreclosure. I believe that part, actually." Jennings's voice softened a degree. The particular gentleness of a cop who decided which thread was actually going to unravel the sweater and didn't want to yank it too hard too fast. "I think you've been doing exactly what you told yourself you were doing this whole time. Following a complaint queue, responding to tips, citing real code violations on a technicality, never once stepping back far enough to ask why every single tip on this particular block happened to come in anonymous, no callback, right around the time a company called Heritage Square started buying up the building next door. Mercer's jaw worked, his eyes moving from the access logs to Jennings's face to the kitchen window, where a sprinkler had started up on the lawn outside in a rhythmic, mindless arc that seemed, in the moment, to be mocking the whole conversation with its sheer normalcy. "I have a family," he said, finally quiet. "I have a mortgage. County pays not nothing, but it's not enough either, you understand, especially the last couple years." "I understand plenty. There's a consulting fee. Comes through twice a year, same as my regular pay. Direct deposit, listed on my own taxes as a side contract. Reviewing zoning applications for a private firm, completely separate from my county work. My accountant signed off on it as legitimate years ago, never once flagged anything wrong with it." Mercer's voice had started shaking slightly, the particular shake of a man hearing his own rationalization out loud for the first time, and discovering it sounded considerably worse spoken than it had ever sounded merely thought. "I never logged a fake complaint on purpose. I swear to you. I think maybe somebody else used my terminal when I stepped away, lunch, bathroom. I don't lock the screen every single time, nobody does." "Who pays the consulting fee, Mr. Mercer?" The slow cooker upstairs hissed faintly through the floor, and Mercer's wife's voice called down again, something about whether they wanted dinner in 20 minutes or 30, and Mercer called back 30, hun, in a voice that had gone thin and strange, and then he sat with his hands flat on the table, palms down, the posture of a man bracing for a fall he'd seen coming for longer than he wanted to admit. "Meridian Bridge," he said. "Consulting fee comes from something called Meridian Bridge Advisory." Jennings didn't react outwardly, but Mike caught the small shift in her shoulders, the particular tightening of a woman hearing a name confirmed from a second mouth that she'd already half believed from a first one. "You ever meet anybody from Meridian Bridge in person?" Jennings said. "Face, name, anything?" "No. Direct deposit, a portal login for the consulting reports I'm supposed to file twice a year, which, I'll be honest, detective, I've never actually filed anything real into. I just log in, click submit on a template, and the deposit shows up anyway, which I always figured was just how these things worked. Big firm, lot of moving pieces, not every consultant's report gets read close." He looked up, and something in his face had crossed over now from defensive into something closer to genuinely frightened. "You're telling me I'm part of something? That this was never really about code violations at all?" "I'm telling you," Jennings said, "that you're sitting on the exact piece of evidence that's going to decide whether you walk out of this as a witness or get charged as a participant. And the difference between those two things is entirely about whether you start cooperating in the next 5 minutes or wait until your lawyer tells you it's already too late to matter." Mike got the call from Carol Jennings 40 minutes after they left Mercer's kitchen, sitting in Marisol's borrowed car outside the Mercado, watching Netu tape a square of plywood over the window's broken pane in lieu of the glass that still hadn't been scheduled. "Mercer's cooperating," Jennings said. "Lawyer's gonna want immunity for the access log stuff, which I think we can probably give him given what he's offering in exchange. He's already pulled up his own consulting portal on his phone for me, showed me the report template he's been rubber stamping twice a year for 3 years without reading. There's a submission history in there. Every report he ever filed, time-stamped, and a contact field for technical support questions, which he's apparently never once used." "What's in the contact field?" "An email address. Generic looking. The kind a company sets up specifically so nobody ever traces it back to a real inbox. But generic doesn't mean untraceable, it just means slower." A pause, paper shuffling, the particular sound of a woman cross-referencing something against something else on her own desk 2 counties away. "I ran it against a financial crimes database our department's got access to through a regional task force. Got a hit. Same email domain shows up in a wire fraud case out of Sarasota 2 years back. Different development, different company name, same pattern. Same kind of squeeze on a family business. Except that case never went anywhere because the witness who could have testified to the pattern took a settlement and disappeared instead. Different town, same hand. Same hand, and now I've got a domain instead of just a name, which is considerably more useful in a courtroom. Jennings's voice had the particular energy of a cop who just found the loose brick in a wall that had looked solid an hour ago. I also leaned on Dawson's guy, the one Foster booked last night. He's not talking about Meridian Bridge directly. Doesn't seem to know the name at all, actually, which tracks. Soldiers rarely know who's funding the war. But he gave up something else. Said Dawson answers to a phone number, not a person. Calls in twice a week for instructions, and the number's routed through a service that masks the actual line. Can you trace it? Working on a subpoena for the service provider right now. Might take a week, might take 3. Depends how cooperative the company is about handing over routing data without a fight. She exhaled, the sound carrying a tiredness Mike recognized from his own chest. Here's where we are, Mike. We've got Mercer cooperating. We've got a domain tying this to a fraud pattern 2 years and 1 county away. We've got a soldier in booking who can place Dawson at the center of the muscle side of this. What we don't have, still, after a month of pulling threads, is a single human face attached to Meridian Bridge or to the name Reynolds. And we've got 14 days before a bank takes a building out from under an old man regardless of how many threads we've pulled. What's the play? The play is we use what we've got to stop the foreclosure clock first, because that's the only piece of this with an actual deadline attached. And we chase Reynolds and Meridian Bridge on whatever runway's left after Nito's building stops being an emergency. She said it like a woman who'd already made peace with prioritizing the urgent over the important, the particular calculus of triage. I'm filing the fraudulent appraisal complaint with the Office of Financial Regulation tomorrow morning, first thing, with Mercer's cooperation statement and the Whitcomb pattern from the Sarasota case attached. That's enough to get a credible dispute letter into Nito's lender by end of week, which should pause the clock at minimum, maybe kill it outright if the bank's loan officer isn't an idiot. Should. Should's the best I've got with 14 days on the clock, Mike. I'm not gonna sit here and promise you a guarantee I can't deliver. Something in her voice shifted, not quite softer, more like a woman setting down one weight to pick up another. There's a town hall thing Marisol's been organizing. Church Hall on the Row this Thursday. You know about it. Heard her on the phone with the pastor yesterday. Good. Be there. I'm gonna be there too, and I think we're gonna need the whole block standing in one room saying the same true thing out loud at the same time. Same as Calusa Case Commission meeting, except this time we're racing a bank's calendar instead of a development vote, which means the noise has to land faster and louder than it did last time. A pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something more private, almost confessional. I keep thinking about what I told you a few weeks back. About how many more of these there might be. Towns nobody federal's ever gonna flag. I think Mercer just handed us the first real proof that I was right to be scared about that math. And I don't love being right about it. She hung up, and Mike sat in the borrowed car a while longer, watching Netu finish taping the plywood square over his broken window. The old man stepping back to check his work with the particular critical eye of a craftsman, even when the craft in question was nothing more than a temporary patch over a wound somebody else had put there on purpose. 14 days. A domain instead of a face. A bank's calendar instead of a commission vote. He got out of the car and went to help with the plywood, because there wasn't anything else useful to do with his hands at the moment. And Netu handed him the roll of tape without a word, the two of them working in the kind of silence that had become, over the last month, its own particular language between them. Chapter 9. The church hall belonged to Our Lady of Guadalupe, 2 blocks off Palmetto Row, a low cinder block building with a roof that had been patched more times than painted. And by 6:45 on Thursday, the folding chairs Father Alvarez had set up, 120 of them he told Marisol, all he owned had run out, and people stood 3 deep along the back wall, and spilled out the propped open double doors into the parking lot, where somebody had run an extension cord out to a pair of speakers so the overflow could at least hear what they couldn't see. Mike stood near the side exit, the habit of 20 years putting him within 4 steps of an exit in any room he occupied, and watched the hall fill past anything its fire code probably allowed, which struck him, given everything that had happened on this block over fire code violations real and invented, as a small private joke nobody else in the room was positioned to appreciate. Marisol had built the whole thing herself. Flyers in English and Spanish stapled to telephone poles up and down the row, a borrowed PA system from the church youth group, folding tables along one wall holding the same color-coded folders she'd built over 2 months of writing down dates nobody else wanted written down. She stood at the front now, in a blazer that looked borrowed from somebody, maybe a professor, maybe nobody, gripping a microphone with both hands like it might try to leave if she let go with one. "Gracias por venir," she said, and then without pause, "Thank you all for coming," running the whole night bilingual from the first sentence, switching mid-thought sometimes, the rhythm of someone who'd grown up doing exactly this kind of translation between 2 rooms that didn't always know they were the same room. 2 months ago, my grandfather got a citation for a sign that's hung in his window for 11 years. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what that citation turned out to actually be. She laid it out clean, the way Mike had watched her build it over 2 months of legal pads and manila folders. The cleaning fee, the citation pattern traced to Frank Mercer's own login, the shell companies running through the same Wilmington registered agents, the Whitcomb appraisal that had quietly triggered a foreclosure clause nobody at the Mercado knew existed, until 19 days became 14 became, as of tonight, 11. Bobby Davis stood up when she got to his part of it, and rolled his sleeve to show the bruise gone yellow-green now at the edges, didn't say much beyond, "This happened because I cut hair on this block for 40 years, and sat back down to a silence that said more than applause would have. Diane Walker spoke next, brief and dry, the laundromat's almost broken window getting a description that made 2 people near Mike actually laugh, despite the subject, the particular gallows humor of somebody who decided laughing at it cost less than being afraid of it. Marie Joseph spoke in French as much as English, her son apparently flown in from wherever he lived now, standing beside her with a hand on her shoulder the whole time she talked about an oven hood that had passed inspection for 19 years and suddenly hadn't. Carol Jennings stood near the front when Marisol introduced her, badge clipped to her belt instead of held up like a prop, and gave the room the same flat, careful summary she'd given Mike in her own kitchen over the phone. Mercer's cooperation, the access logs, the domain connecting this block to a fraud pattern 2 years and 1 county away. She didn't name Meridian Bridge. Mike noticed the omission and understood it. Some things weren't ready for a church hall full of people who might repeat them to the wrong ears before morning. "What I can tell you," Jennings said, "is that the Office of Financial Regulation has accepted a formal fraud complaint against the appraisal firm involved, with supporting documentation from a county code inspector who's chosen to cooperate. That complaint is going to pause the foreclosure clock on Mr. Lazo's building. I got written confirmation from the lender's compliance department this afternoon." The hall went up at that. Not polite applause, something closer to a held breath finally letting go all at once, and Mike watched Netu, sitting in the front row in the same collared shirt he'd worn to the county commission meeting a month ago, put both hands over his face for a second before Marisol's hand found his shoulder. "That's not the end of it," Jennings said, raising her voice over the noise until it settled back down. "Paused isn't dead. We've still got work to do to make sure this doesn't happen again, here or anywhere else. But tonight the clock stopped." Father Alvarez, standing near the front in his collar, took the microphone next, mostly to remind everyone the hall had a fire code occupancy of 200, and they'd clearly blown past it an hour ago, and the joke landed exactly as well as he'd hoped, a release valve for a room that needed one. The arrests happened 2 hours later, and 40 minutes after the meeting ended, in a coordinated operation Jennings and Officer Foster had built over the previous 3 days, timed deliberately for the evening of the town hall on the theory, Jennings's theory, argued hard against a St. Lucie sheriff's captain who wanted to wait a week for a cleaner warrant, that whoever ran the collection schedule wouldn't expect anybody to move on a night the whole block's attention was supposedly fixed on a church basement. Mike wasn't there for the arrests themselves. Jennings had been clear about that, firm in a way that didn't leave room for argument. "You're a witness in 3 different reports already, Mike. I'm not putting you anywhere near an active arrest scene," and giving some defense attorney a reason to call the whole operation compromised. So he heard it instead the way most of Palmetto Row heard it, secondhand in pieces over the next several hours. 2 of Dawson's collectors got picked up at a gas station off US 1, the same gas station, as it turned out, where Mike had bought a losing lottery ticket 3 weeks earlier, sitting in a parked car doing nothing more incriminating than waiting for a shift change, except a wiretap on the masked phone number. The subpoena had come through faster than expected, a small mercy Jennings credited entirely to a financial crimes detective in Sarasota who, deep in chasing the same domain for 2 years, and had pulled every favor she had to speed it along, had caught enough of the call assigning that shift to make the stop hold up. Hank Dawson himself wasn't at the storage unit when the warrant team arrived. Wasn't anywhere obvious, in fact. His own vehicle gone from the unit's gravel lot, the roll-up door down and padlocked. The unit itself, once they got it open, holding nothing but a folding table, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard wiped clean, except for a faint ghost of numbers nobody had quite managed to erase all the way. A schedule grid that the forensic photographer documented from 6 different angles. Jennings called Mike a little after midnight, voice tight with the particular exhaustion of a long operation that had gone well and incompletely both at once. 2 collectors in custody, she said. Both talking, lawyers not stopping them yet because nobody's lawyered up fast enough to tell them to shut up. Dawson's in the wind. Cleared the unit sometime in the last 48 hours, which means somebody told him this was coming. Mercer's been sitting in a hotel room with a county-appointed minder since Saturday. Doesn't have contact with anybody outside his own lawyer. Wasn't him. A pause, and Mike could hear faint behind her the sound of a parking lot, doors closing, the general murmur of a scene still being worked. I think somebody upstream got nervous when the town hall got announced. Maybe the same masked phone number that's been running Dawson's schedule. Maybe somebody at Meridian Bridge actually pays enough attention to read a flyer stapled to a telephone pole. You worried about that? I'm worried about a man with Dawson's training, and Dawson's temper being loose somewhere instead of sitting in a cell where I can account for him. She exhaled long. But here's the part that matters tonight. Heritage Square's buyout offer's dead. Their own counsel called the lender this afternoon, before we even got the warrants moving. Withdrew the offer entirely once they got wind the appraisal fraud complaint had been filed. I think somebody decided this parcel's not worth the exposure anymore. So Netu keeps the building. Assuming the foreclosure pause holds through the formal investigation, which I think it will, given what's on paper now. Something in her voice eased just slightly, the first real release Mike had heard from her in weeks. It's a win, Mike. Not a clean one. Not a finished one. But it's a real one, same as the marina. Mike found Hank Dawson's name in the news 2 days later. Not in an arrest report, but in a brief item buried on the Treasure Coast section of a regional paper's website. 3 sentences confirming that charges had been filed in absentia against a Henry R. Dawson, 47, in connection with the Palmetto Row assaults, and that authorities believed he had left the state. He showed the item to Jennings over coffee at Yolanda's, the same back booth Mike had sat in with Jenny Baker a lifetime and one investigation ago, and Jennings read it twice before setting her phone face down on the table with more force than the gesture needed. Charges filed in absentia means we know exactly where he was and exactly where he isn't anymore, she said. Same pattern as your Reynolds, more or less. The muscle disappears the second the paper trail gets close enough to matter, and somebody with deep enough pockets makes sure disappears means something more thorough than just skipping town. You think Meridian Bridge moved him? I think Meridian Bridge's whole business model is making sure the expensive, replaceable parts of an operation vanish clean the moment they stop being useful and start being liabilities. Dawson ran muscle for them for years by his own collector's account. That's not the kind of asset you let sit in a county jail, talking to detectives. She turned her cortadito cup a quarter turn, the same habit Mike had watched Jenny Baker perform in this same booth, an unconscious tell that seemed increasingly to belong to every woman who'd ever sat across from him doing this particular kind of work. We got 2 collectors. We got Mercer. We got a domain. We got a county appraiser's license suspended pending investigation as of Tuesday, which I'll take as a real win, even though Whitcomb himself lawyered up tighter than a tick the second the suspension hit. What we don't have, again, same as last time, is the actual hand at the top. Reynolds. Reynolds, or whoever sits above Reynolds, assuming there's a whoever sitting above him at all, which there might be, given how many layers this thing's built with. She drank the rest of the cortadito, set the empty cup down, and looked at Mike with the particular directness she reserved for the parts of a conversation she'd decided mattered more than procedure. You ever think about the fact that we've now done this exact dance twice in one summer? Pulled the local thread, exposed the local players, watched the development die or stall, and never once gotten anywhere near the actual money behind it. I think about it every time I close my eyes. Yeah. She didn't have anything more comforting to offer than that, and didn't pretend to. I filed everything we've got with the state attorney's office this morning. Mercer's statement, the domain trace, the Sarasota connection, all of it, alongside the original Sandpiper file that's apparently still sitting under a federal flag I can't see past. Maybe somebody up the chain finally connects the two and decides 2 towns in one summer's worth a real look instead of 2 separate small county headaches. Maybe. Maybe's the best word I've got these days. She slid out of the booth, dropped cash on the table without waiting for the check, the same habit Jenny had, the same small economy of a woman who didn't like owing anybody the weight. Go check on your grocer, Mike. He earned a quiet Thursday. I'd take one myself if I thought my desk would let me. He drove to Palmetto Row that afternoon and found the block doing something he hadn't seen it do in the months since he'd first walked through that off-key door. Nothing in particular. No citation truck idling at the curb. No black pickup making its slow, deliberate rounds. Just a Thursday afternoon, the bakery's smell drifting out into the street same as always, Bobby Davis's 2 chairs both occupied, Diane Walker's fan blowing on an empty throne chair she still guarded out of habit more than necessity. Netu stood behind the register at Lazo's. The new window finally installed that morning, clean and unbroken, the glass company's sticker still in one corner, and he poured Mike a cortado without being asked. The same 90 seconds of practiced motion, the same pride in the small ceremony of it. Marisol tells me the bank confirmed, Netu said. In writing. Foreclosure clock paused. Real pause, not a maybe. That's what Jennings said too. 45 years, Netu said, setting the cup down. And I almost lost it to a number on a piece of paper I never even saw coming. He looked at the new window, at the morning light coming through glass that hadn't existed 24 hours ago, and something in his face had settled finally into something closer to the warmth Mike remembered from that first cortado a month ago, before any of this had a name. You want to know something funny, Mr. Ramble? Tell me. Marisol says she wants to go to law school now. Real lawyer. Says watching a county detective and a man who used to be a spy fight a bank's own paperwork made her realize that's the actual war worth fighting. He laughed, short and warm, the first real laugh Mike had heard out of him since that first morning. 45 years I run this store, hoping she'll take it over one day. Now I think maybe I just have to find somebody else to inherit the tomato sauce pyramid. She'd be good at it. The law thing. She's good at everything she tries. Always has been. Netu wiped down the espresso machine's portafilter with the same rag, the same motion, 50 years of practice in 4 seconds of habit. You staying in town tonight, or driving back up to your beach? Driving back. Got a boat that needs scraping tomorrow, and a friend who'll ask too many questions if I don't show up for it. Earl Tucker. Earl Tucker. Tell him an old Cuban man up in Fort Pierce says he's lucky to have a friend who drinks bad coffee for free and ends up saving a whole block by accident. Netu smiled, real this time, all the way up into the lines around his eyes that Mike remembered from that very first morning, before any of this had cost either one of them anything. Drive safe, Mr. Ramble. Mike finished the cortado, paid the $1.50 he always paid, even though Netu had stopped trying to charge him for it 2 weeks back, and walked out past a window that didn't have a brick-sized hole in it anymore, into a block that, for one afternoon at least, looked like nothing more than 6 ordinary storefronts doing ordinary business under a Florida sun that didn't care one way or another who owned the buildings underneath it. Chapter 10. The drive back to Colusa Cay took the usual 50 minutes, and Mike spent most of it with the windows down again. The same habit from the day this whole thing started, letting the air move through the cab instead of fighting it with a compressor that had never worked quite right since he bought the truck used off a guy in Vero Beach who swore it was fine. Gus's lot held its usual 6 trucks when Mike pulled in, plus the same rental sedan belonging to the Ohio couple, who had apparently extended their vacation by some margin nobody quite understood, judging by how thoroughly they'd settled into the booth by the window like permanent fixtures of the place. The Marlin sign hung crooked over the door, same as always. Paint faded down another shade closer to nothing, and Mike walked in to the smell of fryer oil and salt, and the particular mildew and pine sol combination that had stopped registering as anything but home a long time ago. There he is, Gus said, setting a Modelo down without being asked, lime wedged in the neck the way it always came, whether Mike wanted it that way or not. Hero of Fort Pierce. Saw it on the news. Wasn't on the news. Was on the Treasure Coast Facebook page, which around here counts as the news. Gus ran the rag over the same 6 inches of counter he'd been running it over for 3 years. Dewey's been telling everybody who'll sit still that he predicted the whole thing back in May. Says he had a feeling about that block. Dewey's never set foot in Fort Pierce in his life. Don't tell him that. He's enjoying himself. Mike drank half the Modelo standing at his usual stool, the wood worn pale and smooth under his forearms, and let his shoulders come down from somewhere up around his ears for the first time in what felt like a month. Earl's Marina sat 8 miles from this exact stool. Lazo's Mercado sat 40 minutes south. 2 towns, 2 summers' worth of work compressed into one, and both of them for the moment still standing. His phone buzzed against the bar top a little after 7, screen lighting up against the dark wood, and for a half-second his whole body braced the way it had braced for a different call exactly 2 months ago. But the number on the screen belonged to Carol Jennings this time, saved properly in his contacts now, none of the ghost number uncertainty that had marked the start of all of this. "You sitting down," she said, no greeting, the particular bluntness she reserved for news that needed a chair under it. "I'm at Gus's. Got a stool and a beer." Good enough. Papers shuffling on her end, the sound he'd come to associate with her working 2 cases worth of files at once, even on what was supposed to be a quiet evening. Got the financial regulator's preliminary report back on Whitcomb. Forensic accountant they brought in did a deep pull on the firm's banking records as part of the license suspension review. Wasn't even looking for what they found, just standard practice for a fraud suspension this size. What did they find? Found the actual ownership chain behind the consulting payments Whitcomb's been collecting on every padded appraisal for the last 3 years. Took him about a week of subpoenas to peel it back far enough, on account of nobody at Whitcomb's firm bothered hiding it as carefully as the shell companies did. Guess they figured an appraiser's books would never get this kind of attention. A pause, the particular pause Jennings used before she said something she wanted to land clean instead of rushed. It runs through 4 layers of pass-through entities, same Wilmington registered agents we've already mapped twice now, and at the bottom of all 4 layers sits a single management account. Meridian Bridge Advisory, same name your friend gave you in your kitchen. And the account that funds Meridian Bridge's own operating expenses, payroll, consulting fees, the whole back office, pulls from a single source upstream of that. Forward Florida Leadership Fund. Forward Florida Leadership Fund, Jennings confirmed. Same PAC as Sandpiper. Same chairman of record. I had the financial regulator's accountant double-check the filing against what I already had from the state attorney's office before that file got flagged federal. And it's not a maybe this time, Mike. It's the same hand. Confirmed on paper, 2 separate forensic accountants, 2 separate counties, 2 completely unrelated investigations that started from opposite ends of the state and landed on the exact same name. Mike set the Modelo down, the condensation already pooling a ring on the worn wood, and looked at the Marlin sign reflected backward in the window glass, at Gus running his rag over the same 6 inches of counter, at the whole small, unbothered evening that had no idea what was sitting underneath this particular phone call. Tom Johnson, he said. Not a question. 12-term Congressman Tom Johnson, Jennings said. Chairman of the Forward Florida Leadership Fund, according to every public filing on record, which means it's not even buried anymore, not really. It's sitting right there for anybody who knows to look, hiding behind the simple fact that nobody ever bothers cross-referencing a PAC's leadership against a real estate fraud case in a town small enough that the wire services never picked it up. That's the man who sat across the table from me at my own hearing, Mike said, slow, the words coming out steadier than he expected them to. Asked me questions for 3 hours about an operation he already knew the answer to. Made sure the cameras caught every one of them. I know. He's the reason I lost my pension. My name. 20 years, gone, because it was cheaper for somebody to burn me than to explain what actually happened overseas. Mike heard his own voice go flat, the particular flatness that used to mean something dangerous in rooms a long way from this bar, and made himself ease it back down before Gus or anybody else picked up on it. And now he's sitting on top of a machine that's been doing this to Earl Tucker and Netu Lazo for 3 years running, probably longer, probably more towns than the 2 we happen to wander into. That's my read too. Jennings let the silence sit a moment. The particular silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something considerably bigger than either one of them had budgeted for when they started pulling these specific threads. I filed everything today. Whitcomb's banking records, the Meridian Bridge chain, the PAC connection, cross-referenced against the Sandpiper file that's still sitting under that federal flag. Sent copies to the state attorney, sent copies to my own chief, and sent a copy, and officially off the books, the kind of thing that could cost me my badge if it goes wrong, to a financial crimes reporter I know at a paper in Tallahassee who's been chasing PAC corruption stories for 6 years and has never once had paper this clean handed to her. Why tell the reporter? Because a federal flag can bury a case file. It's a lot harder to bury a published story. And I figure the only way this stops getting quietly continued and quietly flagged is if enough light hits it, that burying it stops being cheap. She said it with the particular weariness of a woman who'd already calculated the personal cost of that decision and made it anyway. I don't know if it works, Mike. I don't know if Tom Johnson ever sees a single consequence for any of this, given how many layers he's built between himself and a county appraiser's bank account. But I wasn't going to sit on paper this clean and let it die in a drawer, same as the first batch did. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if it actually does something. She exhaled, the sound of a woman closing one file in her head to make room for whatever came next. Get some rest, Ramble. You earned a quiet weekend, same as Netu did. I'll call you if anything moves. She hung up, and Mike sat there a long moment with the phone still warm against his palm, the bar's noise washing back in around him now that the call had ended. Dewey's voice carrying down the row, mid-retelling of his Fort Pierce prediction to the Ohio couple, who looked politely baffled but charmed anyway. The muted TV in the corner running a fishing show rerun that might have been the same episode from 2 months ago, the same flat-brim hat, the same triumphant tarpon flopping once before vanishing back into water the color of weak tea. Gus came down the bar with the rag, looked at Mike's face, and set a second Modelo next to the first without being asked, lime wedged in the neck the same way as always. Bad news, Gus said. Old news, Mike said. Just finally got proof of it. He walked the beach the next morning before the alarm would have gone off anyway. The tide pulled back the same shelf of packed sand it pulled back every morning, glossy under a sky just starting to gold at the edges. He worked the detector in slow arcs, heel to toe, the same metronome rhythm that had started this whole summer 2 months and a lifetime ago, and for the first 400 yards found nothing worth keeping. A pull tab, a hair clip, a quarter so corroded it might as well have been a washer. He'd gone another 100 yards past the public access, almost to the jetty, when he checked his mailbox app out of habit and found a new message sitting at the top, no sender name attached, just an address, a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing, the kind of address a person generates specifically to use once and abandon. The subject line read, 2 for 2. He opened it standing in the wet sand, detector idle in one hand, gulls working the tide line a few yards off without much interest in what he was doing. The body of the email held no greeting and no signature. Just a single photograph, low resolution, clearly taken from across a parking lot with a long lens. Tom Johnson, recognizable even at this distance and this quality. The same face Mike remembered from a hearing room 3 years ago, standing beside a black sedan shaking hands with a man Mike didn't recognize, both of them caught mid-laugh at something neither photograph nor email bothered explaining. Underneath the photo, 4 words. He knows your name. Mike stood there a long moment with the phone in one hand and the detector hanging loose in the other, the tide working its slow retreat around his ankles, the sun coming up gold across water that didn't care one way or another what any of this meant. He thought about Jenny Baker's taillights shrinking down a dark street 2 months ago, about a gray sedan pulling away with its headlights coming on a half-second too late, about a text that had known exactly when to tell him to leave a gas station parking lot before trouble found him there. He thought about Earl Tucker's collared shirt and Netu Lazo's new window and a block in Fort Pierce that for one Thursday afternoon had looked like nothing more than ordinary storefronts under an ordinary sun. 2 towns. 2 summers' worth of fights, except it had only taken 1 summer to run through both of them. 2 confirmed connections to the same pack, the same chairman, the same machine running quiet and patient through shell after shell after shell. And now, for the first time since a Senate committee room 3 years ago, somebody on the other side of all of it had looked back and said his name out loud on purpose in writing where Mike could see it. He deleted the email. Didn't screenshot it, didn't forward it to Jennings yet. Not until he'd had time to think about what sending it meant and what keeping it meant and which one cost him less. Then he put the detector back over his shoulder and kept walking, The same slow arcs heel to toe, because there wasn't anything else useful to do with the morning, and because the beach, unlike everything else in his life this summer, had never once asked him a single question he didn't already know how to answer. The sun came up the rest of the way gold across the water, and somewhere past the jetty a pelican folded its wings and dropped into the surf after something it had decided, with more confidence than the evidence probably warranted, was worth the trouble of catching. The end.